Breathe in. Is the breath as pure as your first? Lungs inflating, consciousness generating. You open your eyes, but only darkness greets you, and aside from your own panicked breathing, the only other sound to be heard is the gentle tapping of raindrops on steel. You try to stand, but something is holding you in place, clamping you to your seat, leaving only your arms and legs free to move. The past is a great dark void. You have no memory of how you got here, no memory of yourself. You are trapped in the darkness, nameless and alone. You realize something is attached to your face, and when you reach up to touch it, your fingertips are blocked by a hard metallic protuberance near your mouth. You're wearing a mask, one that's fitted so tight it aches, but when you try to remove it, the pain is unbearable. As you attempt to draw deeper and deeper breaths through your mask, you find yourself descending into a panic. You shove and wrench at your restraints as frustrated grunts crescendo into trembling wails. You kick, you scream, twisting and turning your body until suddenly the left side of your neck begins to tingle as if grazed by a finger of frost, and you feel yourself begin to calm. Instead of wrestling with your restraints, you lean into them, feeling the chemical tingle working its way through your body. It feels like a mother's love, though when you try to picture your own, only a blank, featureless face hangs silent in your mind. You hope the feeling lasts forever, but it doesn't, and the soothing pitter-patter of the raindrops is suddenly and violently drowned out by the roar of machinery. You feel your seat begin to move. You wonder if you truly are shrouded in darkness, or if it's your mask acting as a blindfold, and as the thought overwhelms your exhausted, narcotics-addled mind, disorientation ushers in a dull anxiety. This time, there is no tingling in your neck, no overwhelming sense of bliss. Instead, a deep red glow suddenly banishes the darkness, illuminating not only your temporary prison, but also your fellow prisoners. One is sat to your left, the other to your right, with a contraption that contains you being triangular in structure. Both men's faces are covered by what you can only assume is the same variety of mask that you've been forced to wear. They appear as hideous, obsidian skulls, complete with rubber flaps that cover the ears and an opaque, tinted visor. One man seems perfectly calm. The other seems terrified beyond reason. And just as you once did, he grips the restraints with white knuckles, his shoulders rising and falling in quick succession. You feel his terror in the pit of your soul. He is a mirror image in almost every facet, but just as it occurs to you to reach out and comfort the man, another roar of machinery proceeds in an announcement from a cold and mechanical voice. CDV stability optimal. Prepare for descent in. The word barely finds purchase in your mind before the mechanical voice begins a countdown. 5. You look to your companions, one still unmoved, the other hyperventilating. 4. The panicked of the two begins shaking his head back and forth, begging, pleading for mercy. 3. You feel your heart rate increase as the terror of uncertainty takes hold. 2. You grip your restraints, your own breathing quickening as you hold on for dear life. 1. Your eyes tighten, your muscles braced. Release. The sudden drop makes your stomach feel like it's trying to push its way out of your mouth, and as your descent becomes more and more rapid, your ears pop painfully as a sudden and violent barotrauma occurs. You hear the air rushing past your cramped container, the entire structure seeming to pulse and vibrate as you plunge into the depths of the earth at hundreds of feet per second. It feels as if any moment now, your steel capsule was smashed into the earth below, crushing and killing you in a fraction of a nanosecond. The featureless face of your mother appears to you again, but there are no tears, only terror and confusion. Suddenly, you hear a banshee scream of steel grinding against steel, and the feeling of nausea subsides as the capsule's speed reduces. As the huge metal brakes bring you to a steady stop, the great scream continues for a few moments, then suddenly falls silent. With your capsule hanging stationary in some unknowable abyss, you continue to tremble with residual terror. The calmer companion remains still. The other appears to have passed out entirely. His head and arms hang loose with only the restraints to keep him in place, but As another groan of machinery sends the capsule reeling, he appears to wake up again. After a brief period of steady movement, the capsule splits into three, and as your seat rotates away from your masked companions, you are once again thrust into an inky black void. Before your restraints unlock, rising above your head like the arms of some overprotective parent, a bright white light flickers on, one that appears to be emanating from the very mask which is attached to your head. It illuminates in the space in front of you, and as you climb from your seat, you see equipment and workspaces that are clearly of scientific nature. You turn, your masked flashlight bathing the capsule in a harsh, sterile glow. It appears to be attached to some kind of vertical rail system, one which allows it to traverse a tunnel of unfathomable depth. You try to peer upwards, beyond the capsule, but either the mouth of the tunnel is covered, or you are so deep that sunlight fails to reach you. You then look down, gazing at the seemingly unending abyss. The only sound you can hear is that of your own breathing, startled but steady, yet the uneasy peace is suddenly broken by a hiss of static and a flurry of voices. "What the fuck is going on? Where the fuck are we?" The panicked man's voice buzzes directly into your ears. "Who the fuck are you people? Why can't I remember anything?" He claws at his mask as the calmer man watches, motionless, unsympathetic, until suddenly, his erratic movements slow, then cease altogether. Soon, he too is awash in anxiolytics, his terror dulled through chemical comfort. You turn to the calm man, then ask him if he knows where you are. He shakes his head, but before he has a chance to speak, that same mechanical voice you heard prior to your descent suddenly buzzes in your ears. "Access the equipment compartment at the base of the controlled descent vehicle." You turn your head, your headlamp illuminating a previously unnoticed storage unit at the base of the capsule. The calmer of the two men approaches it, then opens the first of the three compartments. Contained behind the sliding steel doors, the first familiar thing you've seen since your awakening. It's an Enoshima ZX-22 extractor laser, the kind used by deep-sea mineral miners. Although it's only the size of a large nail gun, the ZX-22 is capable of concentrating a series of high-powered lasers onto an area no bigger than a pinhead. The combined energy of the lasers then raises the surface temperature of whatever they touch to just over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. With its sodium-ion batteries supporting over 30 minutes of solid use, it can be used for boring, cutting, mineral extraction. But in the wrong hands, such a powerful piece of mining equipment can prove itself a devastatingly deadly weapon. You approach the storage compartment, picking up the laser by its sling. "Do you know how to use that thing?" The calmer of the two men asks. Along with his mask, he wears black combat boots and a plain black utility suit. "Yes," you reply in an uneasy voice. I don't know how, but I do." As the formerly panicked man treads over to the cache, your calmer comrade slides open the second of three compartments. You don't recognize the model, but what the calm man pulls from the compartment is clearly some kind of pump-action shotgun, sleek in aesthetic, utilitarian in function. None of you have the slightest idea why you might require a means of defending yourselves, but it's nevertheless a comfort to witness the calmer man's proficiency with it. He deftly cocks and loads the thing, stuffing a tube-like cavity with half a dozen of the cherry-red shells provided. The scared man experiences a moment of recognition when the gunner slides open the third and final storage compartment. "Thank God," he says, a palpable relief in his voice as he lunges towards a small digital device. "What is it?" the gunner asks, gesturing towards what appears to be some variety of handheld computer, complete with miniature keyboard and digital display. The other man tinkers with the device's exterior before a soft ambient light begins to emanate from its screen. "This little baby is our ticket to getting out of this place." You can practically hear his grin behind the mask as he continues. "It's like a digital master key, highly illegal. I can use it to engineer a backdoor in just about any computer system you can imagine." A short exchange of information begins as the three of you quickly realize that none of you are in possession of either your short or long-term memories. But before the discussion can continue any further, the mechanical voice once again buzzes in your ears. "Restore power to the facility. it says. "You both heard that, right?" asks the gunner. You and the engineer nod before he continues. "Look, no one's getting out of here without power. We should see where this takes us." Again, you and the engineer nod, and with the gunner at the lead, the three of you take your first tentative steps into the darkness. Painting your surroundings with the beam of your headlamp, you spot charts and research papers, microscopes and tablet computers. Many items of stationery bear the acronym CEC and a logo that consists of red, green, and blue stripes. The logo seems oddly familiar, but there's no time to dredge through your consciousness. You must keep moving. Various markings on the maintenance stairwell wall give you clues to the facility's purpose. You see words like research, development, canteen, accommodation, recreation, before finally reaching a level labeled reactor. The large heavy door to the reactor room is sealed off with bulky locks made of a strong metal alloy. Fortunately, they are no match for your mining laser. The stairwell is bathed in a vibrant, violent incandescence as the concentrated beams of light converge. The small area of metal on which they meet begins to smoke, bubble, then eventually glow. And after slowly working the laser through the hefty chunk of metal alloy, it falls heavy onto the concrete, its echoes singing around the stairwell. It takes two of you to pry open the heavy steel door to the reactor room, and once you're inside, the mechanical voice buzzes in your ears again.
"Locate and activate the auxiliary power generator."
This takes a matter of minutes, with the gunner yanking at a gyroscopic handle for a few seconds before smashing his palm into a large green button. A small digital display flickers on as the generator hums into life, then the mechanical voice speaks again.
"Commence fuel loading routines."
Both you and the gunner look to the engineer. His face is a dark void. Only the rising and falling of his chest betrays his increasing anxiety. He looks down at the pocket computer, holding it in both hands as if to reassure himself, then gets to work. The engineer patrols the room until he finds the reactor's primary control console. Then, after sliding back a small slot on the base of the pocket computer, he pulls a long, thin wire from it before attaching it to the console. Tapping away at the pocket computer's miniature keyboard, the engineer brings the console to life, then accesses its basic input and output systems. "Okay, I'm in," he says. "Just give me a minute to orient myself. I want to look before I leap."
"Make it quick,"
the gunner growls, and as the shotgun tightens in his grip, you wonder if his purpose is to defend or enforce. With finger strokes as diligent as they are dexterous, the engineer continues his work for a few moments, punctuating his progress with a shallow sigh of relief. "Okay, I got it. Loading U-235 fuel cache now." He hits a button, and the entire facility seems to groan as some great unseen piece of machinery begins to move. Moments later, the mechanical voice once again drones in your ears.
"Commence control and coolant routines."
The engineer gets to work, laying the pocket computer against a free section of the console before leaning over and studying it. He is completely absorbed, his digits dancing across the keyboard until you hear a second sigh of relief. "Okay, I think we're good to go. Powering up the reactor." He breaks off for a moment, continuing to feverishly type until he suddenly yells out, "Now!" You feel an intense but momentary vibration beneath your feet as the entire facility seems to awaken from its dormant state. Lights flicker on, computer screens spark into life, and just for a moment, you entertain the idea of hope. But you are wrong to do so. Moments later, the lights of the reactor's room ceiling abruptly shuts off, their sterile glow replaced by the ominous pulsing of blood-red emergency indicators and the wailing of the emergency alarm system. Over the alarm and outside of your mask, you hear another voice, one that seems to emanate from the very ceiling above you. It's a woman's voice, soft and calming, but what she says sends terror coursing through your veins.
"Warning. Suboptimal temperatures detected. Commence moderation procedures immediately. Warning. Suboptimal temperatures detected. Commence moderation procedures immediately."
The engineer begins feverishly typing on the pocket computer. Fuck! There's something wrong with the moderation procedure, he says anxiously. Then shut it down! I can't! If I shut it down now, the whole thing will fucking blow! Do something! I'm fucking trying! There's nothing you can do but wait and watch. Your vision aglow with pulsing crimson, the incessant wail of the alarm system clawing at your eardrums. Your knees begin to feel weak. You lean against a dead console. This is it, you think. This is the end. But for the time being, death is a luxury you are not afforded. Suddenly, the alarm ceases, and the pulsing red warning lights dim, then die. I did it, the engineer says. I fucking did it, you guys. The gunner sighs, his shoulders dropping with relief. You try not to vomit in your mask. Okay, there's good news, and there's bad news, the engineer continues. The good news is I just stopped a nuclear meltdown, and we still have the reactor running at a limited capacity.
And the bad news?
The gunner asks. We only have enough power to supply 1 or 2 subsections of utilities. I can send everything to something labeled surface elevator, which seems like a no-brainer, but then The engineer is cut off by the return of a mechanical voice. It seems louder than before, more direct.
Divert reactor output to Area 74B.
There's a brief but pregnant pause, then the engineer speaks again. It's listening to us, isn't it? I'd be surprised if it wasn't, the gunner says. But there's nothing we can do about that now. This area that it's telling us to power, does that place have the surface elevator? There's no way for me to find out using this console, the engineer replies. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but I guess we can always come back. Divert power to a different section once we get a better idea of the layout. Then do it. The engineer diverts power, then after detaching his pocket computer from the primary reactor console, you begin the search for Area 74B. It quickly becomes evident that the facility is the size of a small city. Corridors and hallways seem to stretch for miles, and at one point, you climb so many stairs in one of the pitch-black maintenance stairwells that your legs ache from the exertion. You discover that Area 74 encompasses several different floors and facilities, each a massive complex all into itself, and upon reaching the large iron door marked 74-A/74-B, you prepare to utilize your mining laser. However, when you step forward, you see the lock has already been cut. Your group freezes, wordlessly considering the implications, then after prying open the door as slowly and quietly as possible, the gunner takes the lead. The 3 of you stalk the hallways, remaining deathly quiet as you close in on Area 74B, and suddenly, after peeking into an open doorway, the gunner suddenly recoils before halting your progress with a single raised fist. With careful, calculated movements, the gunner leans back around the threshold, quietly analyzing the room's contents. You and the engineer remain quiet for a few moments, but the tension proves too much for one of you. What is it? The engineer asks. Bodies, the gunner replies. 3 of them. They look like us. After rounding the corner, you understand what he means. Although the remains are mostly skeletal, they appear to be wearing almost the exact same clothing and equipment as you and your own companions. But even more concerning than their presence is the manner in which they appear to have been dispatched. Their bodies are in pieces, skulls partially crushed, and great sections of their utility suits appear to have been torn open around their torsos. But perhaps most concerning is that all 3 of the deceased appear to have removed their masks prior to death. I'm guessing they didn't do this to each other, the gunner murmurs. The implication is clear. Whatever happened to these 3 poor souls could well happen to you too. They look old, remarks the engineer. He is correct. Apart from what appears to be a few streaks of dried gore, the remains are little more than dried out husks. And that means whoever killed them, the engineer continues, they're probably dead too, right? Not if it was some kind of automated system, the gunner says. And if you just fed power to this place, I'm worried you might have woken it up too. The gunner drifts over to one of the bodies, kneels, then wrenches a second shotgun from one of the dead men's hands. He inspects the weapon, finds it unloaded, then slings it over his shoulder before rising to his feet again. "Hey," the engineer says, his voice barely above a whisper. "Aren't you gonna give us one of those?"
Do you know how to use it?
The gunner asks in reply. The engineer pauses. "Well, how can I know unless I hold it?" he asks. "Besides, he might." And he gestures to you. You look at the shotgun. It's intimidating, unfamiliar, dark in color and dark in nature. "I don't know you, and I don't trust you," the gunner states. "If you ever find yourself really needing one of these, you can pick it up off my corpse." And the discussion ends there. You continue through the complex, and when you reach the door to Area 74-B, you discover that it too has had its lock destroyed by those that came before. You pull the door open, hoping to see light on the other side, but as the heavy steel groans and the door squeals on its hinges, you're greeted by the same impenetrable abyss on the other side.
"I thought you powered this place up,"
the engineer asks. "I did. At least, I sent as much power as I could to the consoles and fabricators. The engineer explains. "There's no point in having lights and air conditioning if we can't use the machines. I mean, why else send us here?" And as if on cue, the mechanical voice buzzes in your ears.
"Collect a fist-sized sample of specimen number 21.
It says. Once again, there is a pause as the information is processed. "Did I just hear the word specimen?" the engineer hisses. He's immediately hushed by the gunner.
"Yes, you did,"
he spits.
"Well, keep quiet before you get us all killed."
Upon locating the area of the complex which houses its so-called specimens, your sense of dread only deepens. The word invokes images of grotesquely deformed monstrosities floating in tanks of hydrostatic fluid, but in this case, it seems the specimen is of a purely geological nature. Standing in a tall plexiglass case like some great gray monolith is specimen number 21. To remain as quiet as possible, you use the mining laser to cut a large hole in the plexiglass case. The gunner reaches in to test the rock's durability. A chunk crumbles into his hand as he pulls it away. "Well," says the engineer, "that was easy." The gunner tosses him the chunk, then returns both hands to the firearm. You brace to hear the mechanical voice in your ear, and you don't have to wait long.
"Locate and analyze audio log number SM0112.
"Audio log?" whispers the engineer. "These things got us grabbing rocks and listening to people's diaries? So what the fuck is going on here?"
"Enough questions,"
says the gunner.
"The audio log. Can you use that thing to find it?"
He nods towards the pocket computer. "I guess. Unless it's a really private audio log, it'll probably be stored in some kind of shared network," the engineer replies. "All we gotta do is find a local console." Finding a connection takes minutes, and the engineer goes to work, delving into the facility's digital infrastructure with mere strokes of his thumbs. "Okay, I think I got it," he says. "Audio log number SM0112, recorded by Dr. Daniel Ugwu on August 14th of 2026. The engineer seems to stumble over the date. You two are incapable of remembering what year it is.
"Just play it,"
the gunner says. The engineer complies. The console's small, integrated speakers crackle to life.
"Dr. Yin, this is Dr. Ugwu over at Sample Testing. I would never normally subvert organizational hierarchies, but I have deep concerns regarding the accuracy of scientific characterization within our research. In summary, I wish to bring to your attention a discrepancy in the characterization of Sample 21 by Dr. Toshi. Firstly, despite Dr. Toshi's assertions of hazardous radiation emissions from Specimen 21, our meticulous analysis reveals an emission rate of no more than 3.5 sieverts. It's imperative to note that this level falls within the background radiation range and poses no discernible harm. While the sample has presented perplexing data, it indeed emits a measurable substance. However, it may not conform to our conventional understanding of radiation. Secondly, while I hold great respect for Dr. Toshi's contributions, I have reservations regarding his classifications of Sample 21 as a geological entity. Upon closer examination, although the atomic structure exhibits similarities to sedimentary rock, I propose an alternative hypothesis, that the substance in question may not be a geological formation at all, but rather of microbial origin.
The engineer looks down at the fist-sized sample of chalky rock in his hand, then lets it drop onto the console's surface. "Now they fucking tell us," he says in a cracked whisper. The voice from the console continues.
At this juncture, it remains a theoretical proposition. However, based on my observations, it appears that a subset of cells has undergone biostatic preservation during the division process. If this preservation has rendered these cells inert, the associated risks are mitigated. Nonetheless, if these cells are in a state of dormancy rather than inactivity, there exists the potential to inadvertently trigger reactivation, the consequences of which remain unclear and potentially perilous. It's essential to underscore my unwavering confidence in the dedication and competence of our research team, as well as the overarching project. However, I am compelled to express concerns that our zealous pursuit of results may inadvertently overlook significant and hazardous contingencies. While it is plausible that Dr. Toshi's perspective may be well-founded, it is also possible that my concerns stem from the strain of our demanding workload. In the event of an unforeseen incident, I implore you to ensure the safe transport of our specimen to our surface-level colleagues. Crucially, any specimen may be rendered inert and subject to rigorous containment protocols to avert any unintended consequences.
The audio log ends as abruptly as it started, and a heavy, ominous silence returns for a few moments. "What the fuck were they doing here?" the engineer asks. You all stare at what is no longer just a hunk of chalky gray rock. It has taken on the air of something else, a sleeping chimera, a creeping death.
"Something we gotta fix,"
the gunner murmurs in reply. The engineer thumbs the pocket computer again before talking. "That wasn't the only audio log on file," he says. "There was a reply in this thread recorded about 3 weeks after the first log. It seems Dr. Yin sent a response." The engineer taps the pocket computer a few times, then the console's small speakers fizzle into life again.
"Daniel, this is Steven."
There is an easily detectable fear in Yin's voice.
"I think you were right about Specimen 21. It went down for testing a few weeks ago, and they just quarantined the testing team. There's no comms in or out, and both floors above and below are teeming with security personnel. There are rumors that the directors are going to lock down the entire facility by the day's end. No one will say why, but I know that it has something to do with the Specimen 21's testing phase. Do you really think they'd lock 1,000 people down here without telling us why or for how long? I understand we have safety procedures for a reason, but if it's true, I'd like to get a message out to my family, at least so they know not to worry so much. Good luck, my friend. I'll try and keep you posted."
The audio cuts out. That's the last audio log I can find. September 7th, 2026. The engineer says. At least that's the one that's not either corrupted or redacted. They must have evacuated the facility not long after that, or they really did lock the whole place down. But then if all those people ended up trapped down here, you begin the thought, but the gunner finishes it. Where are they now? Any discussion is cut off by the sudden return of the mechanical voice.
"Transport the sample to the biocontainment facility."
You heard it, the gunner says. Let's bring it what it wants. The three of you creep along the corridors of Area 74B, successfully navigating to the area marked biocontainment. Aside from the gentle beat of your footfalls, the hallways remain deathly quiet. The pitch darkness and almost impenetrable silence make the facility feel more like a tomb than a place of science. But before you can allow your mind to linger too long on the ever-lengthening list of questions, you find the entrance to the biocontainment facility. Just like the others, the lock on its doors has been cut through with a mining laser, and inside sit several pieces of large, industrial-looking machinery. As if on cue, the mechanical voice sounds off in your ear, instructing the three of you on how to manufacture a solid, sealed container of an inert version of Specimen 21. First comes the inertia, turning the once dormant cells into a version that cannot wake up again. The engineer approaches one of the devices, studying it for a few moments before inserting the sample into a small receptacle. He then taps a few times on a small digital display, and then the machine groans into life. It is loud, uncomfortably loud, so loud that anything living and breathing for a long way off will be able to hear the hum of machinery. You think of the three bodies lying there, torn up, and so do your companions. For the next 10 minutes or so, the engineer works as quickly and diligently as possible, muttering anxiously to himself as he does so. You and the gunner keep your eyes on the doorway, the tension rising with each passing minute. At any moment, you expect to hear the steady rhythmic clunk of some automated security drone making its way towards you. Perhaps having been forewarned, you'd fare a little better than those that came before. But it'll take either martial mastery or a stroke of good luck to take down a larger model without sustaining fatal injuries in the process. The reality is, you'll probably end up like the others, completely overwhelmed by something stronger, faster, and more agile than a human could ever be. You'll end up smashed and gutted on the cold steel floor panels, having died the moment it picked you up on its infrared sensors. Each second feels like an eternity, and after the engineer transfers the now inert sample to a containment device, the steady hum of machinery pitches up into a growl. You feel a slight tremor underfoot, the noise so clamorous that it drowns out the engineer's anxious chittering. If anything is coming for you, it's coming for you now. When the machinery finally comes to a stop, and that same grim silence returns, it's almost a comfort. There are no sounds of security drones, either bipedal, quadrupedal, or airborne. The facility remains quiet as the grave. The engineer studies one of the machines for a moment, pulls open some kind of compartment, then produces what appears to be a small metal cylinder. "This is it," he said. "This is our ticket out of here." And as if in confirmation, the mechanical voice returns to your ears.
Return the secure sample to the controlled descent vehicle for immediate extraction.
For the first time in what feels like hours, you feel a brief glimmer of hope. There was a time when you feared you'd be trapped down here, alone in the dark, airless tomb, until you died of hunger or thirst, or by the hand of whatever unthinking security drones had smashed the skulls of those that came before. But now, with a mechanical voice inviting you to return to the steel umbilical you woke up on, to return to the Earth's surface, to return home, a proverbial light can now be seen twinkling at the end of a long, dark tunnel. All your fears will soon be quelled and all your questions will be answered. All you have to do is make it out. Moving as quietly as you'd arrived, the three of you began the long, arduous process of navigating from the biocontainment facility of 74-B all the way to the derelict laboratories you'd first stepped foot in. You retrace your steps along miles and miles of pitch-black corridors, heart pounding with the prospect of your imminent freedom. Yet the excitement is dulled, tinged even by the legion of unanswered questions that claw at your conscience. Why can't you remember anything? What happened to the people here? And what kind of reception awaits you on the surface? Will you be paid, thanked, or hailed as heroes? Or will you be returned to the dark, dreamless void from whence you came? You try not to think about it. You certainly don't share your thoughts or feelings with your companions. No doubt they're wondering the same things too, but speculation is pointless. Answers will be forthcoming. The silence is a comforting shroud. Its breaking will be a warning. There comes a moment when the three of you pass an open doorway, the interior a void of impenetrable darkness. The gunner is to your front, the engineer to your rear, and as he passes the open threshold behind you, a dry, raspy voice croaks from the dark interior.
Help me.
All three of you freeze. The voice was like nails on a chalkboard. It commands your undivided attention.
Help. Please. Help me.
A few seconds of silence pass. None of you dare move a muscle. Then slowly the engineer begins to walk towards the open doorway.
What are you doing?
The gunner hisses, but the engineer doesn't listen. He just keeps on treading towards the unobstructed entrance, his headlamp jumping from surface to surface as he searches for the survivor. Impulsively, you follow. If someone else is trapped down here with you, it would be cruel beyond measure to simply leave them to die. You imagine yourself in the same position, envisioning the pure maddening terror of being abandoned down here in the cold and the dark. Suddenly, you see him. Propped in the corner is another of your number. His mask is identical, his overalls a dead match for your own, yet he remains perfectly still. There's no rising and falling in his chest. He does not react when both you and the engineer illuminate him in the beams of your headlamps. You take a few steps closer. The engineer stops. Both of you can now see the holes in the rubber of his gas mask, the cracks in its jet black visor, and the yellowing bone of the bare skull which lies beneath. Dead men don't speak, at least not with the living. In which case, where was the voice coming from? As if to answer your question, the voice once again breaks the dead silence.
Help me.
It says, the consonants bubbling, melting from a human's voice into that of something unspeakable, something that's perched on the ceiling directly above you. As you crane your neck, and the beam of your headlamp hits the thing that's attached itself to the ceiling, graying organic matter recoils as if unaccustomed to its shine. At its base, the thing appears partially human. The shape and articulation of its pallid, ashen limbs is hauntingly familiar, yet the sticky, viscous substance they secrete is frighteningly inhuman. The figure appears prostrate, forehead touching the metal ceiling as if in prayer. Yet sprouting from their shoulders, back, and buttocks are dozens upon dozens of slender, silvery tendrils. They writhe over each other like a tackle box full of maggots, twisting and turning, glistening in the bright white light of your headlamp. It croaks, but the voice doesn't come from its once human throat. It comes from the tendrils, from the very core of them. They slowly begin to reach out towards the engineer, still begging for help as he begins to back away. Then before he can turn to run, they dart toward him with lightning speed and snatch him from his feet. The engineer lets out a scream so loud and full of terror that it's like a needle being driven into your ear canal. They leap backwards as the gunner enters the room, training his shotgun on the mutated, pewter-colored limbs that keep the thing glued to the ceiling. He lines up a shot, but before he can pull the trigger, the creature uses its tendrils to drag the engineer up into the air and closer to its trembling body.
Get it off of me! Get it the fuck off of me!
The engineer screams. The gunner tries to gain a better angle, circling the unfolding chaos as you climb a desk to try to close the distance. Your mining laser is only effective at a few feet, and as much as you try, you cannot climb high enough to use it as an offensive weapon against the creature, but still you try. The lasers converge harmlessly just shy of the creature's former human appendages, arms and legs that are now horrifically disjointed. It does nothing but bathe the creature in a bright, violent eminence, illuminating the horror that unfolds before your eyes. The engineer struggles in the tendril's grip, but it's no good. There are too many, and they are too strong. The creature continues to make a mockery of human speech as it subdues the engineer, begging him for help as its tendrils begin to grip and tug on the edges of his gas mask.
Please, God, help me, please, please! I'm begging you, get this thing out of me!
He screeches. The creature mimics certain words and phrases, listening, learning, as it holds him steady and tears off his mask. The action causes the engineer a great deal of pain, and the scream he lets out is an abominable one. But that's not what holds your attention for a terrible moment. What draws your eyes is the engineer's face. You recognize it. You've seen him somewhere before. You just can't place where, and you can't place when. You resort to reaching out to the engineer in the hopes that you can grab a hand or a foot, but he is firmly out of reach, and the only reward for your effort is a full view of a stomach-churning violation. As the engineer's mask drops to the ground beneath him, the creature's tendrils begin to worm their way towards his face. He is utterly powerless to stop them, and as they worm their way down his throat, up his nostrils and into his ears, his screams are muffled, then finally silenced.
Drop the sample!
The gunner begins to bark.
Drop the fucking sample!
The cylinder remains in the engineer's fist, trembling in a death grip as he endures the unimaginable. The gunner responds by reorienting himself, aiming the shotgun toward the tendril-wrapped engineer. You watch in abject horror as the gunner sends 4 shells worth of metal fragments into the engineer's back. It becomes limp in the creature's grip, and the sample falls to the ground with a loud clunk. You don't need to be told to grab it. You don't need to be told to run. And within seconds of the brutal mercy killing, you and the gunner are hurtling through the dark. You run until your lungs burn, until you feel as if though it might fill your mask with vomit, and then you run some more. You follow the gunner's every step. The sample tighten your grip, praying that he's correctly guiding you through the maze of dark corridors. Then suddenly, the scenery starts feeling a little more familiar. You find the maintenance stairwell, and after scrambling down a few floors, you come to the research and development section you first emerged from. You can hear your own heart thumping in your chest by the time the great medical umbilical comes into view. And for the first time in what seems like hours, the mechanical voice sounds in your ear.
Enter the controlled descent vehicle and prepare for extraction.
You and the gunner practically leap in your seats, pulling down the restraints and preemptively locking them in place. You tuck the sample in between your body and the restraints, ensuring that it won't be lost should your grip suddenly fail. You expect the vehicle to reform into its pyramid-like capsule, but it simply sits there a moment, long enough for you to hear something echoing down the corridors you've only just escaped from.
God help me! Come on!
The gunner barks.
Get us the fuck out of here!
All you can do is grip your restraints, hoping beyond hope that the extraction process begins before that otherworldly horror arrives to drag you back into the dark. You greet the sudden sounds and sensations of the capsule reforming with electric relief. You're almost there, almost out of the dark, but not quite yet.
Cage stability optimal.
The mechanical voice says.
Prepare for ascent in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
In the moments before the capsule begins to rise back up along heavy titanium rails, something slams into its exterior, causing it to violently shake as the hum of machinery begins to rise in intensity.
Help me!
The creature's gray tendrils begin to slither into the capsule as it clings to the metal exterior. They force their way through every crack and seam, probing for you, hunting for you. The gunner opens fire at point-blank range, shredding and bursting some of the tendrils, but there are too many. They snake around the shotgun, pulling it away from him before another set jerks forward and punches into his abdomen. He lets out a roar of agony as they snake their way through his insides, wreaking some terrible, unknowable devastation. You watch as the tendrils turn on you. You try to lean away in your seat, but the restraints hold you in place, forcing you to watch as the glistening, wet tendrils worm closer and closer and closer. They begin to touch you, wrapping around your hands, then your arms, icy cold yet slick with mucus. You writhe and buck, willing yourself to close your eyes so you don't have to see what comes next. But you can't. Terror pries them open and forces you to bear witness. One of the tendrils reaches the plexiglass of your visor, poking and prodding for a moment before it's joined by multitudes more. You watch, frozen, as several of the tendrils seem to shiver and shake, prompting the emergence of sharp black spines. They reel back, as if preparing to smash their way through your visor. But just as a wave of terrible acceptance begins to wash over you, the mass of tendrils is torn away, as something smashes into the creature clinging to the capsule's exterior. It's over so fast you can barely compute it. 1 second, you are in the final few moments of your life, the last few seconds of relative comfort before being butchered by some subterranean abomination. Then the next second, there is safety, salvation, victory. Tears well up in your eyes as you grip the restraints, feeling the great umbilical dragging back to the land of the living. You feel the cylinder containing the sample still wedged between your body and the restraints, right where it should be, right where it belongs. And as a familiar screeching of steel signals a steady deceleration, you finally entertain an idea that you wouldn't have dared to over the previous few hours. I'm safe, you tell yourself. Everything is going to be okay. As the capsule slows to a stop, you once again hear the sounds of raindrops hitting the exterior of the capsule. It is the single most comforting sound you can ever recall hearing. After a few moments, the capsule begins to move, and when it finally separates, you can see that you've been deposited in some kind of airlock. After your restraints unlock and rise above your head, you stand up and take a single step down from the small platform which contains your seat. As you turn, your gaze immediately finds the gunner. He is slumped back in his seat, deathly still, a steady stream of blood and bile oozing from the gaping hole in his abdomen. You look down at the sample, the very thing he and the engineer have given their lives for, and you are filled with a compulsion unlike any you've ever known. Placing the sample on the ground behind you, you take a few steps towards the lifeless gunner, then step up onto a seat platform. It feels like a violation, like desecrating the dead, but you have to take his mask off. You have to see his face. After getting a grip of his head and mask, you discover that the mask is most firmly attached to a strap anchored to the rear of his skull. You tug at it, ripping away a layer of flesh as 3 metal prongs dislodge themselves from the bone of his skull. Then, careful not to inflict any additional mutilations, you peel back the remaining rubber from his pale, pallid face. As you toss the gunner's gas mask onto the floor behind you, you look upon his features, and you feel your heart sinking into your chest. You've seen this face many times before. It's the face of the engineer, but it's also the face of another, a face from down among the barren synapse plains of half-forgotten memory. Fearing you're about to pass out, you step back down from the platform, steadying yourself as your heartbeat and breathing begin to quicken. You try to make sense of what you're looking at, but there's no sense to be made. The best you can hope for is to turn around and search for answers among the living. After stepping into what turns out to be a decontamination chamber, you're hosed down with vapor disinfectant, the rushing air so loud that your ears ring upon its cessation. When the inner door of the chamber opens up, you're faced with a long, sterile-looking corridor. Each section is divided by sections of lengthy plastic drapes, and you have to push your way through each one before finding yet another set of doors in front of you. The sign above them reads, Command and Control. And inside, you are quite certain that you'll find the people who saw fit to send you down into that deep, dark hole in the first place. But when you push open the doors and step into the cold, dimly lit room, all that greets you is death. There are bodies, loads of them, all equipped and dressed identically to yourself. Many appear to have used one of the many shotguns lying around to take their own lives. They lie headless, splayed out on the ground, or sit propped up against the walls, slumped down or over, displaying their open skull cavities like hideous spring blooms. Others appear to have walked out of an open doorway before shooting themselves. Some have taken the time to remove their own masks, others couldn't wait to die with the wind on their faces. Only a handful have faces that appear intact or recognizable, but all are identical to those of the gunner and engineer. You don't have to see the faces of the dead or decayed to know what they look like. You might be without memory, but you're not without a brain. Not a single living soul remains in the command and control center. It's just as much a graveyard as the facility underground. But this is not what crushes the last of your hope. This is not what snatches away the final remnants of your sanity. As you step towards the open threshold, you look out onto a dead planet. The sea of dusty charcoal soil that stretches out before you is so vast and unending that it makes your head spin, and although a steady stream of drizzle falls from roiling iron-gray clouds, there's not a scrap of greenery to be seen. On a wall near the open doorway, someone has used a mining laser to cut 3 short words into the cold metal alloy. It won't stop. The message reads. For a moment, you stop and wonder if you should find the courage to join your departed brothers. There's no hope above the surface, only dark spaces and unanswered questions. Yet it is the latter which keeps your finger from the trigger. At your feet, you spot a single trail of footprints in the earth leading off onto the desolate horizon. If you follow, you will die of thirst, lost out there in that vast charcoal desert. But when you die, at least you will die on the surface. At least you will die in the light. A few days before Thanksgiving of 1969, I landed a job as an entry-level reporter at the Post-Standard, which is the local newspaper up in my hometown of Syracuse, New York. I was young, I had a foot on the career ladder, and the world still seemed like a bright and welcoming place. But just 6 weeks later, my entire world fell apart with the arrival of a little white envelope. Daniel Frederick Wilson, the letter read. You are hereby ordered for induction into the Armed Forces of the United States and report at Syracuse Transit Hub on May 11, 1969 at 6:30 a.m. for forwarding to an Armed Force induction station. I'd been drafted, and although I'd make a dozen stops at various training facilities along the way, I was ultimately destined for one place: Vietnam. What followed were 8 weeks of basic training over at Fort Dix, and for a while, it looked like I was doomed to be placed in an infantry regiment. But then I discovered that because of my journalism degree, there was a chance that I could weasel my way into the writing staff of Stars and Stripes, the U.S. military's daily newspaper. Then, just a few days before we were due to graduate, my drill sergeant pulled me into his office with some bad news. Stars and Stripes didn't need any more bodies, but there was an opportunity for me to become a dog handler. It wouldn't keep me out of the field completely, but according to my sergeant, all I'd have to do was roll up with my canine, sniff out a few booby traps, and then the engineers would roll up and I'd be back in the rear in no time. Easy as ABC. But as it turned out, all that stuff about being safely in the rear turned out to be a bunch of bullshit. Because me and Tack, my 3-year-old German Shepherd, got into more firefights than I can count. Tack got his name after one particularly close call that happened on a routine patrol near Cu Chi. We're on point when, all of a sudden, Tack, who was called Rex back then, started alerting like crazy. I'd never seen him act so downright scared before, and when the commanding officer saw it, he ordered his guys to unload their weapons into the jungle ahead of us. What followed was nothing short of a lead storm, as the soldiers tore up the foliage in front of us for a solid minute. When the fire finally stopped, there was nothing. No movement, no return fire, no groans of dying men, and there was a moment where I thought the whole thing might have been a false alarm. But sure enough, as we pushed up through the jungle, we found drag marks, trails of blood, booby traps, the works. If it wasn't for Tack, there's a chance the entire platoon would have been wiped. He'd saved our lives, and we all knew it. Well, goddamn, dog man, one grunt said. The hound of yours is sharp as a tack, ain't he? And after that, it just sort of stuck. Tack sniffed out every single ambush we ever came up against, including the one that almost killed him. It started when some poor grunt managed to snag a tripwire connected to a 125mm tank shell. I don't even really remember the blast. I just remember waking up on my back with someone dragging me through the jungle, away from the ambush site. My first thought was for Tack, but As I looked back to tell the soldier dragging me to go back for my canine, I saw that it wasn't a soldier at all. Or rather, it wasn't a human soldier that was dragging me. It was Tack. He had one of my shoulder straps gripped tight between his teeth and was dragging me back towards the rest of the platoon with all his might. We were putting out a lot of fire, but Charlie was giving as good as he got, and as one burst of machine gun fire ripped up the ground in front of me, I watched it miss my legs by just a matter of inches. The next thing I know, Tack lets out this almighty yelp before diving on top of me. For a moment, I thought he'd been shot, but he hadn't. He was trying to shield me from the enemy. The poor little guy had no idea how they were trying to hurt me, but he desperately didn't want that to happen, even if it meant putting his body in the way of their bullets. I tried to push him off of me. I tried to keep crawling, but Tack wouldn't budge, and only once the shooting had died down could I manage to shift him. But then, instead of getting to his feet and wagging his tail as if to ask me, "It's over, right?" Tack just slumped down next to me and let out the weakest of whimpers. He was alive, but barely, so I decided to do the exact same thing he'd done for me. I tried to save his life. I told the platoon commander if he didn't put Tack on a medevac with me, I'd make it my life's work to ensure that he never received canine support again. It was a total bluff, and it might have worked, but it'd take a whole lot more insubordination to save Tack's life. When we landed back at Dak To, I rushed Tack to the medical tent and demanded that he receive treatment. "Get the goddamn mud off my operating table, soldier," one surgeon said. "I'm a doctor, for Christ's sake, not a veterinarian." I didn't say a word. I just pulled out my .45, locked and loaded, and then pointed it in his face. The doctor looked into my eyes and saw months upon months of bullets, blood, and booby traps staring back at him. A moment of silence followed, then the surgeon got to work saving my canine's life. I'm sure you'll all be as pleased as I was to learn that Tack survived with nothing but a few shrapnel scars under his fur, and although it took him a while to get back on his feet, he made a complete recovery. Tack and I might have been physically okay, but in terms of my flagrant disrespect for the Army chain of command, I was up shit creek without a paddle. However, the incident left the top brass in something of a predicament. I know there was at least one lieutenant colonel who wanted me breaking rocks in Leavenworth until I was 100 years old, but then there was another who wanted me written up for a Bronze Star on account of saving half his battalion. I don't know who else went to bat for me, but someone up there must have liked me, because in the end, I got off easier than I ever could have expected. Rather than risk pissing off every dog handler in country, the brass simply scrapped my Bronze Star and offered me an honorable discharge instead. It was definitely a case of jump before we push you, but I was okay with it. I couldn't have cared less about some crappy medal because I left Vietnam with the one thing that really mattered to me. Due to the wounds he sustained in combat, Tack had to be scrapped from the Army's canine program, and he was headed back to a dog pound back in the US, unless, of course, I stepped in to take ownership of him. When I got back to Syracuse, I didn't have a pot to piss in. My head was all screwed up. I felt like I'd aged 20 years in 18 months, but I had happiness, and I had hope, because I had my best friend in the world with me. I had Tack. It took me 4 or 5 months to get back on my feet, and fortunately, after a chance meeting with the editor of the Post-Standard, I ended up getting my old job back. I'll be forever grateful to him for giving me that opportunity, as the structure and steady income it brought helped me put my old life back together. Then, one day, he called me into his office with the proposition of a lifetime. Some editor friend of a friend in DC needed an article written, only the prospective author had just taken ill and couldn't complete the assignment on time. Struggling to find a replacement, the editor called up his publication's New York City desk, but since none of their reporters had the hours to spare, the job made its way to us. "What's the subject?" I remember asking my editor. "You heard much about those churches down in Kentucky? The ones that use snakes during their sermons?" "A little," I replied. "I thought they made that illegal." "Well, since when did the law stop anyone from doing anything?" I saw his point, then almost choked on my coffee after asking him who the publisher was. "National Geographic Magazine." he said, a big smile stretching across his face.
Now, I don't want to jinx you by saying this is your big break, but it doesn't get much bigger than this.
He wasn't wrong. Getting my name in a big publication would be a phenomenal boost to my public profile, which would lead to more work, more publicity, and so on and so forth. I would have been a fool not to accept the offer, so I did, having no idea what I'd just gotten myself into. Despite the drive down to Kentucky being a 9.5-hour slog, it certainly made for some pretty scenery. I got to watch featureless suburban sprawl slowly erupt into the green, rolling hills of Appalachia, but as much as it made for a pleasant journey, my ass was in a goddamn coma by the time we got there. Tack didn't seem to mind this long journey at all. He was used to being on the move, and there was no way in hell that I was putting him in a kennel for an indefinite period. Every so often, he'd shove his head out of the passenger window to renew his spirits, and since I had no choice but to feed him burgers from some roadside grease trap, I could see why he considered it an upgrade. It was late afternoon when we arrived in Lexington, and to my surprise, getting information on snake handling churches was much easier than anticipated. All it took was a few pictures of Bud down at the VFW, and I had those wrinkly old doughboys singing like canaries. They told me that if I wanted to find snake handlers, I'd have to go southwest to where Kentucky meets the Virginias, but since the practice was outlawed, they might prove difficult to track down. I told them how Tack and I had a lot of practice finding things that didn't want to be found. Most got the joke, and one gave me a solid lead. The last anyone had heard of an active snake handling church was just 2 or 3 years back in a little town named Pilgrim. And the next morning, I was back on the road, driving towards the West Virginia state line. The further I drove, the wider the landscape became, but it also felt like I was driving back into the past, too. It was everything. The old Hudson trucks, the dated-looking signage, and by the time I was out near Pilgrim, the roads had degenerated into nothing but dirt tracks flanked by dense, dark woods. Every so often, the claustrophobic country roads would open up into what the locals called hollows, relatively flat, treeless areas that host homes and small businesses. Frog Pond Hollow was home to the Rabbit's Foot General Store, a place that served as the Hollow's gas station, barber shop, and grocery store. As I stopped to fill up my tank, the clerk wandered out to greet me.
Not often we see New York plates around here,
he said, an air of slight suspicion to his voice. I explained that I was in the area for business, and I'd appreciate some gas and a bite to eat. That's all that was needed to spur his hospitality. For $1.50, the guy brought me a plate of something he called corn pone pie, which was essentially a kind of cornbread filled with a rich beef chili. He also brought out a plate of free hamburger meat for Tack, the first of many encounters with the Appalachian generosity. After I complimented his cooking, he asked what kind of business I was on. I didn't want to spoil all that goodwill by telling him I was a reporter, especially not one that was charged with writing a story that might result in his friends or neighbors being arrested. But it was unavoidable, so I broke it to him gently. The instant he heard that I was there to write an article about snake handling, I could tell that he felt tricked into talking me. He sighed, shook his head, and then turned to walk back inside his store. I had to think on my feet if I wanted to keep his trust and attention, so I did the first thing that came to mind and tugged on his heartstrings. I told him I was looking for the snake handlers because I wanted to tell their story, a story of how the government of the United States, a country founded on religious tolerance and freedom of expression, was trampling the rights of good, hardworking Americans. I told him that arresting snake handlers who volunteered to test their faith with no danger to anyone but themselves was nothing short of un-American, and having recently returned from Vietnam as a combat veteran of the United States Army, I considered it my duty to continue the fight against tyranny, be it foreign or domestic. Trust me, what I actually said was probably twice as schmaltzy, but it worked exactly as intended. According to the clerk, almost everyone in Appalachia knew of at least one church or pastor that still took up serpents, as he put it, but it wasn't something that was practiced openly. Following the deaths of 2 worshippers back in the 50s, Pilgrim had been the focal point of a snake-handling crackdown. Rumor has it that the pastor was bitten too, but unlike his flock, he went on to make a miraculous recovery. Since then, they'd taken their rather unique form of worship underground, which left me with the question of how I'd infiltrate such a proceeding. But perhaps a more pertinent question was how in the hell the pastor had survived what I was told was the bite of an African black mamba, a snake whose venom is 100% fatal when left untreated. Victims described the pain of the bite as like 2 red-hot hypodermic needles piercing your skin, and how the venom's necrotic properties cause the surrounding flesh to blacken and rot. Even worse, the intense swelling of the affected area is said to be one of the worst forms of pain imaginable, yet snake handlers vow never to seek medical attention or take any kind of painkillers in the event they're bitten. Instead, they put their survival in God's hands. Sometimes he comes through for them, other times not. When I asked the clerk if he knew of any local snakebite fatalities, he just shook his head. "They get bit all right. Not too often, but they do," he said. "And the way I hear it, they always seem to pull through for some reason. Who knows? Maybe the Lord really is looking out for them." It's then that I asked how I'd go about securing an invite to one of these snake handling services. The clerk just looked at me, asked what unit I served with, and once I'd confirmed, he walked into the back to make a phone call. When he re-emerged, he held a small torn-off piece of paper in his hand. "Walk into the woods off Laurel Fork after dark," it said. "No pictures." It was all he had for me, but it was all I needed. After sundown, me and Tack walked out the small motel we checked into, got into my car, and drove over to Pilgrim. By the time we reached the dead end of Laurel Fork, and I switched on the old flashlight that I kept in the glove box, I'm not afraid to admit that I was downright nervous. The darkness gave the overgrown, rust-eaten place a deeply sinister feel, like it was a place humanity had yet to properly tame. It was the first time Tack and I had gone anywhere so ominous or unfamiliar since Vietnam, but there was something else too, something I couldn't quite put my finger on until the following night. Like I said, I was so nervous that Tack could sense it, and he stayed glued to my heel for most of the walk. Then after a few minutes of trudging through the darkness, I began to hear something that sounded almost like singing. Moments after, I saw a dim light shining from between some trees in the near distance. I got a little closer, then realized what I was looking at. It was the shape of a large revival tent, set up in a small clearing, and the light was coming from the lanterns of 2 dark and shadowy figures. After spending a minute or two in debate with myself over how next to proceed, I switched my flashlight back on, then slowly began to approach the revival tent with Tack close by my side. I had no idea how they were going to react, but I also realized that walking away meant blowing a golden opportunity to see a snake-handling sermon with my own eyes. As I got closer, I heard a man's voice calling out to me. "Welcome, brother," the figure said. "I trust you've adhered to the terms of our agreement." "Yes, sir," I replied, only then realizing who had really penned the note. "No cameras, just me and my dog." "Good," the stranger replied. "Now, come meet Pastor Childers." As he lifted the tent flap, I was met with a surprising sight. I'd gotten into my head that these folks were some serpentine death cult, yet my first thoughts upon seeing them was that they seemed just like any other small-town congregation. A man was playing guitar at the head of the congregation while the worshippers sang along with some cheerful gospel tune. Children clapped along or danced in the aisles, while the few folks who noticed me shook welcoming waves in my direction. It was nothing like I'd expected, but for a moment or two, I thought I might have a total nothing burger on my hands. Once the musical number concluded, the congregation applauded the guitar player before a very distinctive-looking man took the stage. He was pale and stick-thin, with plain Puritan clothing. Atop his head was a shock of wild red hair, while his upper lip was partially obscured by a thick, fiery bronze mustache. Clutched in his right hand, was a small, well-thumbed copy of the Holy Bible. It looked no larger than a pocketbook, but he wielded it like a hammer. As soon as he came into view, Tack's ears shot up and he began to softly growl.
Brothers and sisters,
The man said, his voice penetrating an unblemished silence.
tonight we welcome an esteemed guest in our humble house of worship.
The announcement prompted a handful of worshippers to turn and shoot smiles at me.
He's come all the way down to holler tonight from New York City.
He talked about the place like it could have just as easily been Mars.
But he ain't no federal man come to take away our God-given rights. He's come to show all these tyrants in Washington that we ain't doing nobody no harm down here in God's house. Ain't that right, brothers and sisters?
The congregation erupted in whoops and cheers of approval. And in a way, he was right. If these people were being hospitalized and killed because they were dumb enough to dance with rattlesnakes, that was undeniably tragic. But no one was forcing them, and they hardly advertised themselves either. So for me as a journalist, it really did raise the question, do we actually live in a free country or not? The pastor continued with his sermon for a spell, then after ushering in another musical number, walked down the center aisle to greet me. Yet just as he got within arm's reach, Tack exploded in a flurry of furious barks.
Tack!
I growled down at him.
Quiet, boy.
But Tack would not be quiet. He barked so loud and so intensely that some of the worshippers began to stare with some not-so-friendly looks on their faces.
Brother, I really must insist you tie that thing up outside,
Pastor Childers said, his cheerful demeanor slipping a little as he spoke. Normally, if someone spoke about Tack like that, I'd tell them to go kick rocks, but this was work, so I made an exception. I took Tack outside, and as I tied his leash to a nearby tree, I asked what the hell had gotten into him. Then, for the first time since Vietnam, he alerted. There were no booby traps here, no Viet Cong to worry about, but still he told me, danger. I was definitely concerned, but I'd come too far to just turn back. I told him to stay and assured him that I'd be back in a moment. Tack laid down, shooting me a frightened look, but did as he was told.
Must be a snake that he smelled on me,
Pastor Childers said as I re-entered the tent. At the time, his excuse made all the sense in the world to me, and since he'd given me a conversational window into asking about his snakes, I took the initiative.
My snakes rarely bite,
He said with a warm smile.
They sure got the devil in them, all serpents do, but right here is where Satan's power is weakest. And that's what I demonstrate to these good, God-fearing folks out here. And, on the occasion that they do bite, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. But, having said all that...
He broke off, turning his neck to one side, revealing 2 dark pinprick scars upon his throat. To my knowledge, no one has ever survived an untreated black mamba bite, let alone one directly to the jugular. Yet here stood the pastor, living, breathing proof that it was possible. Only that wasn't quite his version of events. When I asked him how he survived, his response was cryptic to say the least.
That's just the thing, brother,
He said.
I didn't.
When I asked him what he meant by that, the pastor called out to a member of his flock.
Brother Robert,
He yelled.
show our guest how we are unafraid.
I watched in disbelief as a boy no older than 20 fetched a wicker basket from one side of the stage before pulling out the biggest goddamn rattlesnake I've ever laid eyes on. Then, in rhythm with the singing and clapping of the congregation, he starts bouncing this thing up and down in his grip. I expected this rattler to just wheel round and bite him in an instant, but to my amazement, it looked completely disinterested. My jaw's on the floor as I'm trying to figure out if it's the music, the rhythmic bouncing, or if these snakes have been sedated before the service. And I only snapped out of it when the pastor spoke again.
You see, brother,
Childers hissed in my ear.
you see how we got the devil on a leash.
I have to admit, I was impressed. Not only did the kid have brass balls picking up that rattler like he did, but it didn't seem the least bit interested in biting him. It couldn't have been a black mamba, like I'd heard some of the handlers using, but Brother Robert was risking his life all the same. I had to drag myself out of my awe-struck stupor to get the interview back on track, and when I finally asked the pastor what he meant by saying he didn't survive the bite, he just smirked. His lips squirmed like the truth was on the tip of his tongue, but all that came out was a Bible verse.
I'm the resurrection and the life. Whoever lives by believing in me will never die.
My first guess was that Pastor Childers hadn't actually died, more like he'd miraculously survived a period of unfathomable pain and suffering, and lost a little bit of his sanity in the process. But before I could question him any further, one of the congregation let out an ear-piercing screech. Another worshiper rushed to take control of the rattler Brother Robert had been holding, while the boy himself held out his forearm, 2 tiny droplets of blood bubbling up before running down his alabaster skin. He'd been bitten.
You must excuse me, brother,
Pastor Childers said, as a pandemonium erupted.
but please, come back tomorrow night. If the boy doesn't survive, he'll be resurrected. Come and see. Come and see.
And at that, he was gone, sucked into the throng of hysterical worshippers as they flocked around the venom-stricken boy. I left, disgusted at the waste of young life, switching on my flashlight as I walked back into the darkness. Come on, boy. Let's get out of here. Tack jumped up, his tail wagging in relief before we trudged off through the trees. When I awoke the next morning, I had no intention of returning to the revival tent to watch Brother Robert's resurrection. I'd seen enough medics hopelessly laboring over dead men to know that once you're gone, there's no coming back. Instead, I planned to check out the motel before the long drive back up to Syracuse. But then, just as I was loading up the car, I heard a soft, mousy voice calling out to me from behind.
Hey, mister.
It was a young woman, no more than 16, 17 years old.
You're headed down to the revival tent tonight again, right?
I hadn't noticed the night before, but evidently she'd noticed me. No, I replied. I don't know what they're gonna do with that boy, but
He passed,
she interjected, a sadness in her eyes.
last night, a few hours after you left, but they're going to bring him back tonight.
She believed it too, and you could hear it in her voice. I'm sorry, but you can't bring people back. And I felt like an asshole saying it to her, but it was the truth. At least that's what I thought. Your pastor's a liar. He wasn't resurrected. There's no such thing.
Sure there is, mister. And you're going to tell everyone about it.
I slammed my trunk shut and turned to her face.
And why would you want me to tell everyone?
I asked.
That'll probably mean the feds crawling all over these hills, and they'll arrest your pastor, and they'll take those snakes. Because it needs to stop. All of it. It needs to stop.
She was growing increasingly agitated, and her voice cracked as she spoke.
What they're doing down there, it's wrong. Sure, most of the time they'll come back okay, but every so often, they come back different. And they gotta put him down. I don't want to see my Robert like that. I just can't. But they're gonna, and okay,
I said, cutting her off before she descended into what seemed to be a panic.
I'll head down to the tent again tonight, and I'll try to stop whatever they're doing, okay? Thank you, mister. Thank you.
The girl replied, and her cheeks were now slick with tears, and before I had a chance to say anything else, she was on her way. That night, me and Tack repeated the ritual of gearing up, getting in the car, and driving down the Pilgrim. Only this time I had even less of an idea of what to expect. We hit the dead end of Laurel Fork again, and walked through the drizzling rain towards where the tent had been the night before. Once again, they were expecting me, but when I entered, I found the tone to be very different than the night before. Instead of singing, dancing, and clapping, the congregation was silent, and there was a distinct tension in the air.
Ah,
Pastor Childers exclaimed as I walked in.
welcome, brother. God told me you'd return, and here you are.
Childers was standing over 2 white plastic camping tables which held up Brother Robert's lifeless corpse, and it was quite evident that he was dead. He had that deathly pallor about him, that same grim jaundice I'd seen on so many others in Vietnam. Behind him was the same man who'd welcomed me into the tent the previous night, only this time he was carrying a shotgun.
Pastor, we need to talk. Not now, brother. Plenty of time to talk when Brother Robert is back.
Brother Robert's not coming back, Pastor. You and I...
Please, no more talking.
Pastor Childers interrupted.
All your doubts will be cleared soon enough. Now take your seats, brothers and sisters. The hour of resurrection is upon us.
Again, Tack was growling something fierce, but he kept it low, sticking close to my side as we awaited what was to come.
We got something special here, folks.
Childers began.
There's something in these hills that God put here long, long ago, and we must show our gratitude for it.
A murmur of amens returned from the congregation before the pastor continued.
So will it be the resurrection of the dead?
He said, his voice rising with every sentence.
The body that is sown is perishable, but it is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, but it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, but it is raised in power.
The congregation were calling back to him now as he motioned to a man stood off stage.
Bring me the serpent that took the poor boy's life.
Pastor Childers bellowed, and at his command, the man picked up the same wicker basket that Brother Robert had carried just the night before. In it was the snake that killed him, still alive and still deadly. Childers whipped open the lid, plunged his hand into the basket, then raised the snake up by its head. Then as he held it up before the congregation, he produced a small knife and began to slice into the rattlesnake's throat. Once it had been decapitated, another member of the congregation appeared holding a large glass bowl, and the snake's blood was carefully and methodically drained into it before they continued. Then, Pastor Childers placed the snake's remains on Brother Thomas's lifeless chest before taking a short step back.
I declare to you, brothers and sisters,
He bellowed.
that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed.
The congregation began to whoop and holler, and in turn, Pastor Childers' intensity began to build.
In a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed.
He was foaming at the mouth now, fire and brimstone in his words.
Then, and only then, will the saying that is written will come true. Death has been swallowed up in victory.
As Pastor Childers ranted and raved, my attention was slowly drawn away from him. The headless snake that lay on Brother Robert's chest. It had started to move. It was only slight at first, little twitches that could easily be mistaken as belated death throes, but soon it was unmistakable. The dead snake was moving.
Well, death is your victory!
Childers screamed, motioning to the sheer impossibility before him.
Well, death
is your sting.
And at that, the snake began to slither, stump first, into Brother Robert's open mouth and down his throat. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Watching that headless, blood-soaked snake disappear down Brother Robert's throat was the single, most horrifying thing I'd ever witnessed. Nothing I'd seen in Nam can possibly compare. But instead of running for their lives, the congregation were in raptures. Some were weeping, others spoke in tongues, and the rest simply stood there as if in a deep trance, swaying from side to side. Me, on the other hand, it was like I was dumbstruck. I was glued to the spot, just clamoring to comprehend just what the hell I was seeing. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get any more intense, Brother Robert woke up. Tack was just about to lose his mind at that point, unleashing a flurry of high-pitched whines as he tugged at the sleeves of my jacket. He was begging me to leave, but I couldn't. I remember putting a hand to my mouth in pure shock, watching as Brother Robert coughed, spluttered, and gasped for air. He looked terrified, his sunken eyes wide and fearful, and they darted around the room in confusion. The congregation spilled out their seats towards him. People were weeping. Others cried out hallelujah. The joy that they felt was otherworldly, and as Brother Robert embraced his loved ones after a long, deep sleep, he began to smile. All eyes were on Robert. Not a single person wanted to miss a moment of this miracle of resurrection, all except one. The girl who'd visited me at the motel. She was staring at me, this desperate look in her eyes that screamed, for God's sake, do something. But I didn't have to do anything, because Robert did it for me.
Give me some room,
Pastor Childers cried out.
Let me welcome our dear brother back into the land of the living.
The congregation rescinded like waves from a beach, allowing Childers to get face to face with the still smiling Robert. Only as I watched him approach, I noticed that there was something horribly wrong with Robert's face. His eyes were wide open, almost like he didn't have any eyelids at all, and his smile was stretched so unnaturally wide that I swear you could see every single one of his teeth. It wasn't a happy smile. It was something else now. Something ugly.
Robert,
Childers asked.
Robert, it's me, Pastor Childers. I want to...
Childers was silenced by the lightning-fast movement of Robert's arms, and in an instant, his hands were wrapped around the pastor's throat. He gasped for air as the congregation leapt to his defense, trying to pry Robert's hands off his neck. But it was no good. For a man who had been clinically deceased just a few moments before, Robert was horrifyingly strong, and we all heard the moment he crushed the pastor's larynx with a sickening crunch. Robert then swung the pastor around, knocking down several of the congregation as he flung the man's limp body in their direction.
Robert, no! What in God's name are you doing?
It was as if he couldn't hear them. He simply grabbed another member of the congregation and sunk his teeth into her face. The scream she let out was gut-wrenching, punctuated by the sound of a shotgun shell being racked into a chamber.
Get the hell off of her, brother!
The armed man roared, aiming the barrel squarely at his head. Robert let go, spitting out the chewed remains of the woman's nose onto the earthen floor of the tent. And with that same sick smile splitting his face in two, he slowly turned toward the armed men.
Please, Robert,
he said.
Please snap out of it.
Robert responded by taking a few slow steps towards him before suddenly and violently lunging. Buckshot tore through the right side of Robert's skull, popping it open like a smashed watermelon. The boy stood there for a moment, staggering to and fro, and for a moment, it looked like he was about to drop. Then, out of nowhere, Robert once again lunged towards the armed man, grabbing hold of the shotgun and using it as leverage to smash what remained of his forehead into the man's mouth. He fell back, letting go of the shotgun, blood pouring from his pulverized lips. Robert then racked around into the shotgun, a percussive hit to the melody of the downed man's pleas for his life. The man gurgled, broken teeth falling from his bloodied mouth. Robert aimed the shotgun square at the man's hands, clasped together in prayer, and fired. The man howled as everything above the wrist simply disintegrated, all while the congregation begged Robert to come to his senses. Instead, he racked another round into the chamber, aimed the shotgun at the wounded man's head, and fired. The sound of his scream degenerating into a stilted choking still haunts my nightmares. Hearing marked the moment I came to my own senses and got the hell out of that revival tent.
Run, boy, run!
I screamed, but Tack didn't need to be told. He bolted on ahead as the sounds of the unfolding massacre echoed through the trees behind us. I'm embarrassed to say that I'd lost all my military fitness by that point, meaning I was incapable of running far or fast enough to get to safety. At one point, I looked back to see something catching up to us, and at first, I thought it might have been another survivor from the tent, but when I turned, all I saw is Brother Robert, hurtling towards me, shotgun in hand. He pumps one final round into the chamber, raising the shotgun, and something else tears past me in the darkness. It was Tack, barreling toward the thing that used to be Brother Robert, and with his one good eye, it tracked Tack as he leapt towards him and took its last shot. The next thing I see is Brother Robert in the dirt, and Tack has him by his throat, whipping his neck back and forth, chewing and piercing, drowning Robert in his own blood. At first, I didn't think that'd finish him off, but when Tack climbed off of him and Robert ceased to move, I breathed a deep sigh of relief. But it was one that was taken far too soon. No sooner had I said, "Good boy," Tack collapsed to the ground. The thing that used to be Robert had indeed landed his final shot, filling Tack's gut full of buckshot in the seconds before he delivered the killer blow. I went into autopilot, picked Tack up, and ran as fast as I could back to the car. Driving like a man possessed, not even sure where I was headed, I just remember looking over to him at one point just to see if he was still with me, and he was gone. As his big brown eyes stared off into oblivion, I pulled the car over to the side of the highway and burst into tears. I never loved anything in my whole life like I loved that goddamn dog. After we got back from Nam and things got bad for a while, he was the only thing that kept me from eating my own gun. Every single time I thought about ending it, I'd think, who's going to feed Tack? And that was that. All the guys whose lives he'd save, they'd kick my ass if they knew I'd ever dared mistreat him. He was my best friend in the world, and now he was gone. I tried and failed to save his life, just like he'd saved mine that day in the jungle, and just like he did that day in Pilgrim, and that's just something I have to live with. I couldn't bring myself to write the story up. I just apologized to my editor and told him that I had to pass on it. After all, who in their right minds would believe me? When he asked what happened down in Kentucky, I just told him, hunting accident. A few years later, I took a job down in Florida, working as the sports correspondent for the Gainesville Sun, and I ended up retiring here too. I mean to go back to Pilgrim one day to really address what happened, just not yet. Not yet. I got a new dog these days, also ex-military and also a German Shepherd. I think he takes more care of me, more than I take care of him at this point, and he certainly makes for better company than my ex-wife. As for his name, I call him Russ, short for Lazarus, in honor of the dog who, on more than one occasion, gifted me a second chance at life. My name is Joseph Suttree. I'm 29 years old and I'm doing a PhD in psychology at the University of Manchester. Psychology has been a huge passion of mine for close to 13 years now. I opted to study at an A level on something of a whim, not knowing much about it but assuming it'd be interesting. And by the time we reached Christmas break of my year, I was obsessed. I read a ton of Freud and Skinner that winter, then picked up some Piaget in the new year. Then by the time summer came around again, I'd worked my way through as much Festinger and Pavlov as I could muster. Over the course of that year, I came to believe that not only was psychology a fascinating field of study, but it was also the key to unlocking limitless human potential. I mean, think about it. We've become phenomenally proficient at repairing and sustaining our biological hardware, yet we know next to nothing about our biological software. Timely psychiatric treatments might have prevented countless dictators and serial killers from taking millions, if not billions of lives. And although it might sound naive to some, I believe psychology was the only science capable of treating such a malady. My passion for the subject quickly manifested in my grades. Initially, my parents had been skeptical of my new choice of subject, but once they saw how well I was performing, they soon changed their tune. If it meant getting into a better university, they were all for it, and soon began fueling my obsession with entire boxes of secondhand psychology books. When it came to results day, the A star I received in psychology ensured qualification for my first choice of course at my first choice of university, a BSP-accredited psychology course at the University of Manchester. Those first 3 years of uni were some of the best of my entire life, so it was only natural that I'd want to stick around, let my student debt pile up, and pursue a master's degree in the same subject. The only thing keeping me from committing to a PhD was simply not having a topic I felt comfortable enough to base a dissertation on. But then, towards the end of my master's, I was reading an issue of NME when the idea hit me. The article mentioned something regarding the so-called medicinal effects of music. Some studies have suggested that aside from the obvious things like stress reduction or increased motivation, music has been known to have much more tangible effects on the human body. In one study, listening to the right kind of music was shown to decrease the frequency of epileptic seizures, and in another, patients claimed a reduction in physical pain when listening to their preferred artist or song choice. Like I said, the article only lightly touched on the subject and didn't venture how to explain how music had such an effect. Then when I Googled it, all I saw was a bunch of undecided scientists, medieval scholarship, and harebrained mysticism. I'd long been fascinated in music's ability to influence human psychology, but I realized that there was a complete void of information regarding how or why that was the case. And that's when it hit me. If there wasn't a comprehensive paper on music's influence over human psychology, one that explored the more mysterious, less tactile effects, then I would be the one to write it. When it came to research, I found myself falling down a rabbit hole of books, academic papers, and personal accounts. Yet in terms of solid source material, there was very little to work with. I kept digging and digging, finding many accounts to be spurious or anecdotal at best, until I came across the works of a 17th century English philosopher by the name of Robert Hooke. At the tender age of 27, Hooke was given the title Curator of Experiments by a group of wealthy socialites known as the Royal Society for Improving Natural Knowledge. This granted Hooke unfettered access to the organization's research fund, and he used it to conduct some very bizarre experiments regarding the nature of the universe. Citing much of Johannes Kepler's work, Hooke expanded on the Boethian concepts of musica mundana and musica humana, arguing that the universe consisted of matter that's in constant vibrative motion, including that which makes up human beings. If you've ever heard the term music of the spheres, that's exactly what's being referred to, the concept that the universe is a symphony and we're all just instruments to be played. The idea even made it into Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice with the lines, "There's not the smallest orb which thou beholdst, but in his motion like an angel sings." Hooke ended up doing a whole bunch of experiments involving music, sounds, and vibration, and although he wrote an entire series of books on them, I'll try to sum them up in a few short sentences. When you listen to a sad song and it makes you cry, you might think that's a purely emotional reaction. Well, according to Hooke, you'd be mistaken. He'd say that the music you're hearing is having a very physical effect on you, and it's doing so by making your molecules vibrate at the pitches which align with sadness, grief, and heartbreak. In one way or another, that applies to literally everything else in the universe too. For example, a mob of angry people all vibrate at the same furious pitch, just as two passionate lovers share the intimacy of a twin frequency. Everything is subject to the vibrations of everything else, which, in Hooke's eyes, turned musical instruments into tools of near godlike power. It's that last part that really blew my mind, and in the instant I read it, I knew Hooke's name, along with those who'd studied and continued his work, would appear frequently in my thesis. Given he's quite a prominent figure in British scientific history, there are no shortage of volumes dedicated to Hooke's life. But what there's next to no literature on are the composers, if any, that were inspired by his ideas. There's a lot of compositions inspired by the aesthetic of musica mondana. In fact, it enjoyed quite the resurgence as an idea during the early 20th century. Yet there's very little that tries to abide by the science of it. And by that I mean composers that tried to isolate certain chords or frequencies that might influence human thought or emotion beyond more simplistic sentiments such as cheerfulness or sadness. I had to search for a long time to find anything of worth, but after a grueling week-long search, I was introduced to the works of a little-known Polish composer by the name of Władysław Baczynski. In the year 1810, Baczynski was the child of a French father and a Polish mother, both of whom taught him piano and violin from a very early age. By the age of 7, little Władysław was already giving public concerts, and by age 11, he'd composed his first 2 pieces of music, one in A minor and another in C flat major. As you can imagine, he was considered something of a prodigy, and from the ages of 13 to 16, he continued his musical education at the prestigious Warsaw Lyceum. Following his graduation, Baczynski continued to study under some of Warsaw's most highly acclaimed musicians. Yet at age 19, he appeared to have been overcome with a deep and disquieting sense of wanderlust. Financed by his wealthy patrons, Baczynski set about traveling the length and breadth of Europe in a quest to expand his musical horizons. Yet the exact details of his itinerary remain unknown. And the reason why the mystery of his travels is so principal is because upon his return, Baczynski's approach to musical composition proved radically different than before. We know he visited Paris and Berlin and even spent a little time among the battle-scarred towns of revolutionary Italy, but the timeline of his travels suggested he toured many other places along the way. He was also said to be incredibly attached to a copy of Johannes Kepler's The Harmony of the World, which he brought back from Bavaria and would spend hours poring over its pages in between bouts of creativity. It's also been suggested that the reason there are so few records of Baczynski's European travels is that they weren't entirely spent in Europe. Following his death, a small piece of traditional Jala artwork was found amongst his possessions, leading some to propose that Baczynski visited the master musicians of Jajuka, a fabled group of Sufi Muslim musicians whose ghazals had been known to induce trance-like states amongst those who hear them. Before he departed on his travels, Baczynski had been a prolific composer, sometimes producing 2 or 3 pieces of music a month. Yet following his return, Baczynski slowed his output dramatically, pouring months and months' worth of work into a single quintet or concerto. As you can imagine, his patrons expected the results to be nothing short of superlative, and the steady anticipation produced a great deal of excitement among Warsaw's concert-going elite. Yet in 1835, when they gathered en masse to witness the fruit of Baczynski's labors, they were horrified. One critic called his latest work an abomination, while another claimed Baczynski had presided over the ugliest orchestral performance in Warsaw's history. On the second night, a riot broke out outside the concert hall after the audience of a less exclusive recital accused the music of being an affront to Almighty God. After the Archbishop of Warsaw professed deep concern over the concerto, the Fryderyk Concert Hall immediately canceled all remaining performances, and Baczynski fell into a deep and long-lasting depression. One by one, Baczynski's patrons deserted him, until eventually he found himself on the verge of bankruptcy. Yet it's around this time that he was contacted by a wealthy antiquities merchant from the German town of Bamberg. Very little is known about this new German patron, and it seems Bakinski preferred it that way. After the destruction of his professional reputation, he appeared to want nothing more than to go into hiding until it could be restored, and to do so, he would create his magnum opus, his life's greatest work. And for 11 years, Bakinski went completely silent, with only the occasional letter to his family being proof of his continued existence. And then finally, in 1847, he completed his self-proclaimed masterpiece, String Quintet No. 13 in E minor. Most of the musical historians I read agreed that despite the quintet amounting to his life's work, Bakinski was never able to organize a public performance of the piece, but they tended to disagree on why exactly that was. One claimed that Bakinski's contemporaries had called the composition unplayable, while another suggested that Bakinski's wealthy Bavarian benefactor passed away around this time, thus robbing him of financial backing. But a third historian, and admittedly a less reliable one, had a different, much wilder theory as to why the String Quintet No. 13 in E minor was never played in public. In his unofficial biography of Bakinski, author A.J. Carfagno claimed that the composer was able to get financial backing for a public performance, but was never able to progress past rehearsal stages. Only 2 rehearsals were said to have taken place, and on both occasions, the hired musicians refused to continue playing past just a few bars. They were offered more and more money to continue playing until they were apparently offered double the usual rate, yet still, the musicians refused to play, and the rehearsals were unable to continue. Granted, A.J. Carfagno's other work involved UFO abductions and so-called confirmed sightings of Bigfoot, but from what I could tell, Carfagno was the only author I was aware of who had actually been to Bamberg to conduct his own research. Everyone else seemed to dismiss Bakinski as a dried-up has-been who'd simply lost his mojo, where Carfagno, who'd actually talked to Bakinski's distant descendants, had a completely different story to tell. Unlike many other sources which claim his failure preceded a sharp decline in his health, Carfagno claimed a reliable source informed him that Bakinski's death was a suicide. In fact, not only did Władysław Bakinski take his own life in the weeks following the rehearsals, but so did several of the hired musicians. There was a grim logic to Bakinski taking his own life after a second failed comeback, but why would a session musician want to kill themselves after merely rehearsing his material? And not just one of the musicians either. Carfagno claimed that up to 4 were confirmed to have taken their own lives less than a month after rehearsing String Quintet No. 13. I've never been one for conspiracies or the supernatural, but I must admit, my interest was piqued. Even if it was an unplayable monstrosity, I knew I had to get my hands on a recording of it, or, failing that, a copy of the sheet music. Finding any books or papers on Bakinski had been hard, but trying to get a hold of his music was on a whole other level of difficulty. Every single dealer of rare classical music in the UK either told me I'd been misled or that no such copies of Bakinski's music existed. If I really wanted some of his music, it'd be possible to get my hands on some of his formative work, but as for Quintet No. 13, I had more of a chance of finding the Loch Ness Monster, they said. It was disheartening, but it didn't deter me, and through some heavy use of Google Translate, I was able to extend the reach of my emails to Bakinski's native Poland. What followed was a lot more of the same treatment. People told me I was either crazy or I'd fallen for what amounted to a 19th century urban legend, but still I persisted, and my persistence paid off. The Polish record shop owners were right in that I never did find an actual recording, but what I was able to get my hands on was a very old copy of the sheet music. I happened to find a kind of antique shop in Warsaw, but instead of old furniture, it housed old magazines and books. Several hundred of those magazines happened to be music-related, and it was in an issue of a German-language orchestral review from 1921 that I found a short excerpt from Bakinski's String Quintet No. 13. It couldn't have been any more than 3 or 4 minutes long, a fraction of the original work, but from what I could tell, it seemed legitimate. When the issue arrived, wrapped in sealed plastic, I tore it open, then began furiously translating the written text which accompanied the sheet music. The reviewer was not kind to it, and at first, I thought it was somewhat amusing that the reviewer chose to describe Bakinski's work as making him feel physically ill. But then I remembered what I'd read about the musicians following the rehearsal, and suddenly, I didn't find it so amusing anymore. Once I had the sheet music, all I needed to do was find someone to play it for me, and I could either spend hundreds of pounds hiring my very own string quintet, or, and much more in line with my budget, I could use a computer program to scan and read the sheet music with just a few clicks of a button. I'd waited weeks to hear String Quintet number 13, quite literally spending hours at a time just imagining what it sounded like, so when the time came down to sit down and actually listen to it, I felt like celebrating. It wasn't just the conclusion to a lot of hard work either. It had also taken on an air of the forbidden, which only made it all the more exciting once I finally had it at my fingertips. It was about 9 o'clock in the evening when I finally finished scanning and processing it. Then, once it was ready, I poured a glass of wine, dimmed the lights in my flat, sat down in my computer chair, and hit play. At first, there was nothing but silence, but then gradually, the strings yawned into life before unleashing a dampened flurry of discordant notes. There was barely any rhythm to it, and although I could understand why some might have deemed it unplayable, it certainly didn't make me feel physically ill. The frenzy of strings carried on for a few more seconds, but just as I was starting to find it genuinely irritating, they suddenly went silent, and a low, steady drum beat took their place. The percussion continued for a few moments, just long enough for me to get comfortable again. Then as I sat there, eyes closed, I began to detect a high-pitched, barely perceptible note slowly creep into the soundscape. Up until that point, it was the single strangest piece of music I'd ever come across. Not sickening or frightening or anything, just odd. But little did I know, String Quintet number 13 had only just begun. A creeping, rising whine from one of the violins suddenly slithered its way along the bars like a great python. It fell silent for a moment and then slithered again, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck begin to rise. Hearing it the first time was surprising. Hearing it for a second, then a third time, made me feel as if my skin was crawling. The serpentine strings were soon rejoined by the low, violent flurry, along with a third, as yet unheard kind of sound. It could well have been intended for a double bass or some other kind of low-toned instrument, but after being filtered through the digital sheet music reader, it sounded like the death rattle of a Mongol throat singer. Then, as the sound seemed to work its way into the very core of my skull, I began to feel it. There was a faint but sudden pressure behind my eyes, along with a sustained pressure on the floor of my mouth. Before I knew it, I was rushing to the toilet and puking up what little of the wine I'd drunk. But even when I'd completely voided my stomach of fluid and bile, the violent retching continued until I was literally gasping for air. By the time the painful stomach spasms had abated, my cheeks and nose were a patchwork of broken blood vessels, and as I stared at myself in the mirror, itching and shivering like I couldn't get comfortable in my own fucking skin, I wondered what the hell was wrong with me. Finally, after maybe 10 to 15 minutes of puking, then cleaning up after myself, I returned to my living room and was greeted by silence. I sipped at a glass of water, washing the bitter taste of vomit from my mouth, and decided it must have been something I'd eaten. My diet and personal hygiene always took a bit of a dive whenever I was working at full steam, with dodgy takeout and dodgier leftovers being washed down with coffee and wine and then even more coffee. It made sense that my body had just decided no more. And sure, maybe forcing myself to listen to Quintet number 13 did kind of push me over the edge. But I didn't feel like throwing myself out of the window. I felt like taking a nap. I decided to call it quits for the evening, get an early night, then start again bright and early the next morning. But that night, I slept terribly. I don't think I had any dreams, and if I did, I certainly don't remember them. I just remember waking up the following morning after 8 hours of sleep but feeling like I barely slept for 3. It took me 2 or 3 coffees to start feeling like a human being again, and my appetite still hadn't returned after the previous night's vomiting, so I gave myself the morning off before returning to my research. Hours later, after sitting back down at a computer, I noticed the excitement of listening to the quintet had been replaced by a grim apprehension. The first time, I closed my eyes after pressing play, simply as a way of soaking up the music in an artificial darkness. But the second time, I kept them open in order to take notes on what I was hearing. I remember experiencing that same kind of discomfort and anxiety as the bars progressed, but nothing like I'd experienced the first time. So in my head, this confirmed that what I'd experienced the night before was merely a bout of food poisoning. Nothing to worry about, and certainly nothing to do with the structure or sound of the quintet itself. I made some notes on how arrhythmic progression and barely audible tones were clearly designed to induce a feeling of discomfort in the listener, and that Bakinski may well have been endeavoring to create something deliberately hideous. Bakinski had created a kind of diaphony, if you will, a piece of anti-music, proving that his creations could not only be beautiful by design, but horrifying by design too. In a sense, Quintet number 13 was everything I'd hoped it to be. It showed that music could have profound effects on those that listened to it, even if it was in a previously unexplored or unconventional manner. Then right when I felt myself having something of an academic breakthrough, I saw something moving in my peripheral vision. The human brain has an incredible feature built into it, a kind of background app that functions continuously without us ever being aware of it. If you spend a great deal of time somewhere, your brain starts to construct what you might call a visual memory bank. If you've ever played Spot the Difference with two very similar pictures, you probably experienced a different version of this ability. Up close, it's quite difficult to spot the differences, but stand way back from the pictures and let your visual memory soak up the images, and all of a sudden, your eyes start to catch all the little differences in a way that feels almost involuntary. You're not looking at the differences, but nevertheless, your eyes see them. My first-year lecturers would probably have my guts for garters for explaining visual memory so poorly, but you see what I'm getting at, meaning you understand perfectly what I mean when I say that, quite suddenly, there was a dark shape in my peripheral vision where there should not have been one normally. I jerked around in my chair, looking over to the kitchen window of my second-floor flat, where the dark shape had once been. I got up and walked over to the window, making sure it hadn't been a bird or a bloke on a ladder or something, poking his head up while washing the windows to give me an undue fright. There was nothing. I told myself I was exhausted, probably crashing from the sugar and glucose that I'd been swilling from the moment I woke up. To an extent, I was probably right, but that just helped me settle into the bliss of denial, and on I went, oblivious to the precipice on which I was perched. The remainder of the day was spent outlining, researching, and whatever else I could manage in my near comatose state. Then, in the early evening, I called it quits again and went to bed. I honestly thought I was over the worst of it, and all I needed was a good night's rest. Instead, I experienced the most vivid nightmares of my entire life. When I opened my eyes, I realized instantaneously that I was no longer in my bed. I was curled up, naked on a sea of smooth but even stone. It reminded me of the jet-black volcanic rock I'd once seen in a documentary on the Galapagos Islands, both in color and in the way it roiled and rippled in its stillness. The black volcanic mass stretched out before me until swallowed by darkness on every side. Yet somehow, I found myself dimly illuminated by some unseen source of soft, pale light. I remember this childlike feeling of being lost and scared, until suddenly, I heard the faint but familiar sound of String Quintet number 13. I stood up, creeping cautiously towards the sound of the slithering strings. But this time, there was no skin-crawling anxiety, no looming sense of dread. I simply continued across the cold black stone towards the only thing that was familiar. As I walked, I felt my gait synchronize with the steady beats of some great unseen percussion instrument. It sounded different. Everything sounded different. Yet despite being naked and vulnerable, in a place so utterly xenogenous, I felt nothing but a blissful, almost intoxicating comfort. Yet in the very next instant, when the space in front of me was suddenly and silently filled with a colossal, yet indistinguishable shape, a penetrating but very familiar sense of panic overwhelmed me. I stopped dead in my tracks, craning my neck and straining my eyes to get a glimpse of the antediluvian titan cloaked in its veil of darkness. I could make out no visible detail. There were no face or eyes for me to focus on, yet somehow I could feel it studying me, not with interest, but with indifference. What was gazing back at me through the darkness had no name, at least none pronounceable by any human tongue, and all at once it was both ancient yet ageless. I physically recoiled as something which passed for a limb began to plume into the light like liquid smoke. It was covered in an array of larger and smaller digits, countless in number, giving it the appearance of a black tar centipede as they twitched and writhed in their abundance. I calmed slightly when it became evident the thing meant me no harm, then watched as several of the black tendrils appeared to grip something unseen, as if they were somehow clinging to the very fabric of the space around us. Then, in one violent motion, faster than my mind could fathom, the limb ripped what looked like thousands of long, white fibers from out of some small, imperceptible tear above my head. They were a pure, bright white, almost luminous in contrast to the impenetrable darkness that surrounded us, and as I gazed into absolute wonder, I watched as they floated weightlessly above me like some vibrant, deep-sea anemone. I felt awestruck, as if I were witnessing the miracle of creation with my own two eyes, watching as a second limb, maybe even a second being, come into view. The second of the great black limbs took a hold of the loose end of the long white strands, and with the same slow assuredness of its twin, it began to stretch them to what looked like breaking point. In an instant, they were flooded with a deep sanguine red, as if the thousands of pale capillaries were each being filled with blood. When not a single white strand remained and each vessel appeared turgid with crimson fluid, the great black limbs began to push and pull on them, kneading them until blood made way to muscle, and muscle made way to flesh. The thing the limbs created was hideous in its pragmatism, yet the demonstration brought me to my knees. It was like they were telling me, "We did this in just a few of your heartbeats. Imagine what we can do with a lifetime." The next thing I remember, the limbs set the mass of flesh down on the cold volcanic stone. It lay there for a few moments, trembling in its newborn respirations. Then suddenly, it began to move. It appeared as a mass of knuckled flesh, glistening with a grotesquely scented amniotic fluid. Then, after approaching me, urged on by its looming silent parents, it began to clumsily turn around. One side of the knuckled mass was adorned with at least 24 blinking jet-black eyes, tears of birthing fluid dripping from each and every one. As my gaze darted between them, trembling in muted horror at the monstrosity before me, I became suddenly and intensely aware of how utterly mindless the thing was. It was no better than livestock, completely ignorant of life and death and the ever-shifting cosmos that surrounded it. It wasn't evil, just utterly unlike myself, and its presence terrified me. Then, as the mass of knuckled flesh sensed my fear, it too recoiled. Then, although it had no mouth to speak of, it began to scream. I woke up with a start, heart pounding, sheets drenched in a cold sweat. It felt like I'd only been asleep for a relatively short time, but when I rolled over to check my phone, I saw I'd been comatose for the better part of 13 hours. What I just experienced felt so real, so utterly vivid that waking up felt transitory, like stepping through a portal, and the experience left me disoriented, frightened, and completely exhausted. I was hideously behind on my work, and what's worse, I was in no condition to continue. But as much as I just wanted to crawl back into bed and catch up on sleep until I felt human again, I knew that wasn't an option. I knew I had to at least attempt some work on my thesis, and since my obsession with the string quintet was obviously affecting my mental health, I figured the best thing to do was to power through it, so I could just move on to some other form of research. I took a shower, made myself a coffee, and had just sat down to make some notes when I suddenly felt overwhelmed with a desire to listen to Quintet number 13, if only for one last time. I know that might sound completely insane to some of you at this point, but what would you think? That an old, poorly written piece of classical music had put a curse on you, or that you maybe needed a day or two's break from having worked solidly for about a fortnight straight? Besides, 2 incomplete cursory listens did not make for a thorough analysis. I was more than prepared for some minor discomfort for this 3rd listen, but to my surprise, whatever residual anxiety I felt dissipated after just a few bars. No longer did the discordant whine or frenzied flurry make my skin feel like it was crawling off my bones, and after a while, the quintet started to sound almost comforting. Following that 3rd and final listen, I managed to finish up my notes, then got a head start writing up some of Bakinski's biography, most of which had been wedged into whatever this turns out to be. My head was clear, I felt wide awake, and most importantly, I was making massive progress on my thesis. There was just one small problem. I hadn't eaten anything in coming up on 48 hours. I should have been weaker than a kitten by that point, tummy rumbling, blood sugar dipping, probably puking on account of how much hypoglycemia can mess with you. Yet somehow, I felt fine. I hadn't had anything to drink since my morning coffee either, but I hadn't the slightest desire to make another or grab a glass of water. Simply put, I felt whole, in a state of near-perfect bliss, and after days upon days of feeling awful, it was a very welcome change. For hours upon hours, I worked solidly. I poured myself into my work, hammering out a solid 2,000 words before I even felt like taking a break. But when I did, I still didn't feel hungry, and I still didn't feel thirsty, and even though it was getting close to midnight, I didn't feel the need for sleep. The only 2 things I could possibly see myself doing before returning to work was showering and listening to the quintet, so I did both. Now, I won't bore you by reminding you of how it goes, but its effect on me had fully transitioned from a nauseous anxiety to goosebump-inducing, tingling comfort. I wondered how it came to be that I didn't feel the need to eat and drink anymore, if there was something wrong with me, something that I should be worried about. It was with that exact thought rattling around my skull that I decided to test something out. So, standing there, warm water cascading over my shoulders, I suddenly and quite deliberately stopped breathing. With the sound of the quintet in my ears, cradled in the warm steam of the shower cubicle, I counted to a minute without feeling a thing. 60 seconds ticked over to 90, and then by the time 2 whole minutes had accrued and I hadn't felt a single panging for oxygen, I knew something was very different about me. I know that in that moment I should have felt the wildest and most animal panic of my life, yet as I hummed along with the dissonant melody of the quintet, I felt nothing but that same blissful stillness I'd been feeling all evening. It felt like a good thing, like a superpower. I wasn't changing for the worse. I was Man 2.0, Musica Humana, and it could only be a net benefit. I stepped out of the shower, dripping wet, and began drying myself off with a towel. The bathroom mirror was a blur of hot steam, but even through the haze of condensation, I could see that there was something very different about my face. As I wiped away the steam, I saw one of my eyes was completely shot with blood, a glistening, luminous red with all traces of white rendered invisible. Wiping away another layer of steam, I leaned towards the mirror, peeling down my lower eyelid to get a closer look. There was no bleeding, no discharge of any kind, and most importantly, no pain. Yet even though I should have been deeply concerned for my health, I still felt nothing but the same peaceful stillness, like I just instinctively knew that it would be okay. And it has been. The color hasn't returned to normal. In fact, the luminous red has faded to a deep, impenetrable black, but it still doesn't hurt. And to be honest, I don't think I can feel pain at all anymore. I don't know what sustains me now, but I know it's not the quintet. I haven't actually listened to the thing in days now, and when I feel that desire to sink into its depths again, all I have to do is remind myself of the melody, and all feels right again. Whatever is happening to me, on the inside and the outside, it's self-sustainable, and I don't know how to stop it. Shit, I don't even know if it can be stopped. I don't think it was listening to the quintet that did this either. I think Robert Hooke was right, and there's much more to music than we could possibly imagine. There's a language to it, in a way that there's a language or coding to everything in the universe, and I think the quintet might be some kind of metaphysical key, for want of a better word. Only it's not a key that unlocks a door to a physical place, it's a key that unlocks something inside our bodies. The reason that so many people have taken their own lives after listening or attempting to play the quintet isn't because it drives you insane or puts some terrible curse on you. It's because no one's been able to handle the changes it brings. But I can. And so can you. But then you'd never go out of your way to listen to the quintet, would you? Especially not after all the things I've just told you. Growth can be intimidating, and change can be downright scary, so I wouldn't begrudge anyone wanting to just continue on as they are. But this is not some petty lifestyle change. This is not some stupid fucking wellness fad. This is the next logical step in human evolution. In the way I see it, I can either move on without you, or drag you all along with me. You see, I have something of a confession to make. Some of you might have noticed some rather odd noises in the soundtrack of this video. Noises that have made you feel uncomfortable, anxious, or downright frightened. Well, and I really do hate to break it to you this way. Those were excerpts from String Quintet number 13 in E minor. Now before you go panicking and dialing 999 or 911 or whatever your country's emergency number is, I don't know if what you've just heard is enough to induce the changes, shall we call them, not to the extent they've affected me. I just need you all to see the things I've seen, feel the things I've felt, because if you do, you'll realize that what I've discovered, what Bakinski discovered, is going to change everything for the better. We all spend our lives looking for purpose, looking for meaning, looking for God. Well, I've seen it. I've seen God. We are all just strings in its bow. And soon you'll see it too, whether you want to or not. My name is Jürgen Hamann. I'm 82 years old and I was born in the German city of Stuttgart during the spring of 1944. Growing up, I didn't know my father. He was drafted into the army shortly before I was born and didn't return from wherever he was sent. My mother was left to raise me alone, remaining in Stuttgart until the end of the war, then moving on to Augsburg and later Munich. She tried to raise me as best as she could, but before long, the political situation became unbearable for us, and my mother decided to move us out of Germany altogether. A few days before my 12th birthday, I was told that we were emigrating to the neighboring Austria. We took a bus trip into the foothills of the Alps and disembarked at a place called Nazareth, a small, quiet mountain town nestled into the bosom of a picturesque valley. Even though Austria had been absorbed into Germany in the years before, the war had barely touched Nazareth. It was a beautiful place, far away from the agonizing aftermath, and for almost 2 years, my mother and I built a life for ourselves there. I came to experience true happiness in Nazareth, something I've never truly felt before. Yet in December of 1957, that happiness was shattered by something which has haunted me for almost 65 years. That winter, 11-year-old Willy Humus and 13-year-old Didi Müller both disappeared from the forest surrounding Nazareth. But their disappearances were isolated incidents. Over the previous 2 winters, a total of 5 different children had disappeared from towns and villages all over the region, and the incidents continued until 1959. when an East German man by the name of Reinhard Keller was arrested near the city of Graz. The 6'7" mentally deficient Keller stood accused of abducting and murdering 11 children over the course of 4 years, and the number might have been higher if the Italian authorities had been more willing to cooperate. Despite highly sensationalized media reports, any evidence connecting Keller to the children's disappearances was circumstantial at best, and it was expected that he'd be acquitted on those grounds. But that didn't matter, because Keller wouldn't live to see his trial. He was said to be so distressed by the accusations that he became dangerously unstable, and although prison doctors tried their best to medicate him, it wasn't long before he erupted. During a routine transfer procedure, Keller successfully overpowered his guards and managed to wrestle one of their pistols from their grip. But then instead of turning the weapon on his terrified jailers, Reinhard Keller pulled the pistol to his temple and pulled the trigger. The incident caused a huge scandal and many people lost their jobs, but the winter following Keller's death, Austrian police pointed out that no such child abductions had been reported in any of Austria's Alpine towns. They saw this as their vindication. If the abductions stopped, they must have arrested the right man. Only, the abductions hadn't stopped. Not really. And Reinhard Keller wasn't the one to blame. I knew this because Didi Müller was my best friend, and I'd witnessed his death with my own 2 eyes, and whatever took him wasn't human. A psychiatrist later told me that I was mistaken, that Keller had kidnapped Didi, and that my inability to recall his face was down to a deep-rooted trauma response. According to him, my young and fragile mind was simply incapable of accepting the reality of what I'd witnessed. So instead, I'd replaced it with a kind of manageable fantasy, pretending that it was a monster who'd taken my friend and not another human being, and it was some type of coping mechanism. It enabled me to carry on with my life in relative normalcy without having to consider that every strange person had the capacity to harm me. But at some point, I had to accept reality, and I had to accept that monsters weren't real. I was told this over and over again, and out of fear of being labeled insane, I simply accepted it. It was only many years later, following the fall of the Iron Curtain, that people discovered how the child disappearances had continued into neighboring Hungary and Slovenia, and how Reinhard Keller didn't have the mental capacity to carry out such horrific crimes. He was a giant, well into his 40s at the time of his arrest, yet the psychologist reported that his mind was no more developed than the children he was accused of murdering. Such revelations were bittersweet progress for the Austrian police, but for me, the news set me back years. I spent half a lifetime convincing myself that I'd experienced nothing more than a vivid hallucination, only to be faced with a singular, horrifying truth. What I'd witnessed was very, very real. It was December 8th of 1957 when young Willy Humus and his little brother Timo became lost in the forest. The disappearances of the year before had mostly been forgotten by the winter of '57, and the few who remembered took comfort in the fact that they'd occurred near the distant town of Bludenz. It's also worth remembering that at the time it wasn't clear if the children's disappearances were abductions or merely tragic accidents. After all, living in the mountains can be dangerous, especially during the winter. As a result, folk grew careless, and Willy Humus paid for their carelessness with his life. That Sunday afternoon, Willy and Timo went sledding on one of the valley's gentler slopes. Their mother told them to be home before dark, but when the boys failed to reappear, a search party was formed. I remember hearing about them going missing, and particularly worrying for little Timo. We both volunteered as altar servers at Nazarites Catholic Church, and with him being just 7 years old, I knew he was especially vulnerable. With a mix of electric flashlights and flaming torches, dozens of townsfolk took to the forest, calling out the boys' names as they went. It took them hours to finally find little Timo, who was hiding in a hollowed-out tree stump, too afraid to respond to the calls. But when the boy's parents asked him where his brother was, Timo said he didn't know. He later described how he and Willy had become separated after being chased through the forest. Then, when asked who was chasing them, little Timo became visibly frightened before replying simply, "Der Krampus." For those unfamiliar with Alpine folklore, the Krampus is a kind of Christmas boogeyman who acts as the polar opposite of Santa Claus. If a child is well behaved, jolly old Saint Nick rewards them with gifts, But if a child is bad, they get a visit from the Krampus. Then, depending on the severity of the child's sins, the Krampus either whips them with tree branches or drowns them in a large sack before dragging their souls back to hell. It's a story that's typical of Germanic fairy tales, which have a well-earned reputation for being brutally harsh. But that's all it's supposed to be. A fairy tale. Something to scare children into behaving themselves. So, when Timo Homos told the police that he and his older brother had been chased by the Krampus, they naturally assumed he was actually referring to a person. The same person that had taken the children near Bludens the year before. Even more disturbing was Timo's claim that the man had actually caught up with him at one point, only to abandon him in favor of the older Willie. The man had apparently grabbed him, picked him up off the ground, then dropped him again, but not before taking a long, slow lick across his cheek. The news sent the people of Nazarite into a minor frenzy. Local police scoured the surrounding forests, joined by dozens of volunteers from all over the regions of Tyrol and Vorarlberg. They searched by day and enforced a curfew by night, ensuring that all children remained indoors by sundown. At one point, a group of volunteers uncovered 2 sets of child-sized boot prints near where the boys had been sledding, and it was hoped that following them would yield clues to Willie's whereabouts. Yet they discovered that his boot prints suddenly and inexplicably disappeared at a patch of disturbed snow, indicating some kind of heavy struggle. Logic dictated that the only prints left would be that of Willie's abductor, but after carefully studying the blanket of snow, the only other visible tracks were that of a large, cloven-hoofed animal. Despite there being little evidence of foul play, the curfew remained in place. But as the weeks went on, vigilance slackened, while boredom grew exponentially, especially among Nazarite's younger population. Initially, given how uninviting alpine winters can be, it wasn't so bad to be cooped up indoors outside of school hours. But we soon grew restless, and the prospect of sneaking out after dark became a very attractive one. At school, me and Didi hatched a plan to sneak out together. His father had been busy aiding in the search of the missing Humlesboy, and his mother was so occupied with his younger sister that she hadn't noticed him siphoning off a flask of schnapps from the family liquor cabinet. Don't get me wrong, the idea of there being some predatory pervert stalking the region was a very scary one, but the victims were kindergartners or still in elementary school, whereas we were almost 14, young men in the eyes of some. Besides, even if the child snatcher did decide to stray from his preferred demographic, we felt more than capable of fleeing or fending them off. Or rather, that's what we told ourselves to soothe our fears. For almost 2 weeks, we planned our nocturnal indulgence, waiting for the right moment while praying Didi's father didn't notice the missing schnapps. At last, we decided on the final day of school, Friday the 20th of December, to embark on our midnight adventure. As curfew dictated, we went straight home once school ended, then carried out our usual evening routines so as not to draw suspicion from our parents. Then, once they were asleep, we crept out of our houses, then headed for a pre-arranged meeting point on the town's outer limits. Sneaking through the snowy streets, trying to avoid police and civilian patrols, made for some of the most exciting moments of my young life. Yes, it was a rash and reckless decision, yet therein lay the thrill. It was one of our last chances to have a little fun before Christmas kept us chained to our families, and we were never going to pass that up. Twice I was almost spotted by patrolmen, but eventually I arrived safely at our meeting point where I found my dear friend waiting for me. Didi had already taken a few swigs of the stolen schnapps and was so affected that he didn't seem to mind that I was a few minutes late. After swapping a few light-hearted jabs, he produced a cigarette, then, after pursing it between his lips, he struck a match and lit it. Didi took one long drag that erupted into a coughing fit, and even in my sober state, I had to stifle my laughter. It seems so silly to me now, but doing such things brought us great joy, and we were positively elated as we passed the schnapps and our tobacco back and forth. At least until we realized that Didi's coughing fit had attracted the attention of a passing police officer, who suddenly called out for us to identify ourselves. While he had quite clearly heard us, the officer couldn't see us hiding in the small, dilapidated woodshed we used as a shelter, and this gave us an opportunity to slip out the back while the officer approached its front. He soon spotted us following its inspection, but by that time, we had put enough distance between us to render pursuit futile. The only problem was, we weren't ready to call an end to our night of teenage rebellion, so instead of heading back into the safety and familiarity of Nazarite, we ran deeper and deeper into the forest that surrounded it. Walking in deep snow can be exhausting, and running through it even more so. So after just a few minutes of plowing through the vast white expanse, we were forced to stop and catch our breath. Although we were at a safe distance, we agreed to circle the town's perimeter a little to throw off any potential pursuers. Our behavior had undoubtedly drawn the suspicion of the local constabulary, and if caught breaking curfew, there was no telling how much trouble we'd be in. We walked in the belief that we were safely tracing our way around the outskirts of town, but in reality, we were pushing deeper and deeper into the dark, snowy forest. A forest which one of us would never emerge from. I'll never forget the feeling that schnapps gave me, how the sweetness gave way to burning and how the shivers gave way to a balmy warmth. It made everything feel and look different, from the way the snow crunched beneath my boots to the way the cigarette smoke danced in the still night air. It was all so new and fresh. Every sound and every smell more pronounced, more intense, including the stench that drifted into our nostrils as we sat laughing and drinking on a fallen log. It was an abominable stink, and upon its detection, I recoiled to ensure that I hadn't sat in some animal's droppings. Dee Dee smelled it too, but after searching for the source, we discovered we were completely unable to determine its cause. The longer we searched, the more intense the reek, and I remember Dee Dee complaining that he'd never smelled anything so vile in all his life. But I had. The summer after my mother and I arrived in Nazarite, a bird's nest constructed at the top of our chimney became dislodged, and almost a dozen chicks became wedged in the soot-filled darkness below. My mother had to hire a man to clear the mess with a large-handled broom, and the smell that filled the room when the chicks' tiny rotten bodies tumbled into our fireplace was indescribable. But that was the high summer, when midday temperatures can reach almost 80 degrees. So how was it that I could detect such a familiar stench in the frigid depths of winter? In the end, we decided to simply move on to a place with a less offensive odor, but no matter how far we walked, the same hideous smell seemed to follow us. We started to bemoan the fact that our one night of freedom was being blighted by some phantom flatus, but just as we started to see the funny side, Dee Dee's expression changed from one of jolly inebriety to one of total panic. Instinctively, my gaze turned to the section of forest he was staring at, but I saw nothing that might panic him, nothing but tree trunks, snow, and darkness. In a whisper, I asked Dee Dee what he'd seen. There was a long, tense pause before he answered, his words betraying a deep and primal terror.
There's someone in the trees,
he said, a gloved finger pointing off in the darkness. I strained my eyes, trying to make out a figure, a shape, a flash of movement, but the forest was as quiet as the grave. Then suddenly, I saw it. Something peered out from behind the trunk of a skeletal-looking beech, and thanks to the silhouette it struck against the snowy white backdrop, I could quite clearly see that it had antlers. I breathed a deep sigh of relief, cursing at Dee Dee for frightening me over nothing but a deer, yet he remained transfixed by the silent, staring thing, and when he spoke, he sounded half mad with fright.
That's not a deer.
I turned back just in time to witness just how right he was, as the thing I'd once believed to be a deer rose up on its bony hind legs and stood upright before us. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long skeletal limbs, and its silhouette now revealed that its antlers were unlike any I'd seen before. They were twisted, twirling upwards like flame turned to stone, like a pair of unholy monoliths sculptured from pure dread. At first, all we could do was gawp at the thing in a kind of horrified stupor. But when the thing suddenly moved again, pure lizard-brain terror sent us hurtling through the woods. I ran harder and faster than I ever had in my life, bounding through the snow with a vigor that only terror can generate. Dee Dee matched my every stride, until finally, we spotted the distant lights of Nazarite. For a moment, it seemed as if we might actually outrun the monstrous figure. but it was far stronger and far more agile than we ever could have expected. At once, there was a loud clattering of bare branches above our heads as the thing behind us leapt up through the trees to overtake us. Seconds later, it crashed down in front of me, and that overpowering stench of rot and decay became so intense that I suddenly found it difficult to breathe. I turned to run in the opposite direction, but after long fungal fingers wrapped around my legs, I was sent crashing into the snow beneath me. With the wind firmly knocked out of me, I was slow to try and find my feet, but any attempt at escape was futile. The thing forced me back down, its long fingers gripping my skull as it wrenched my face to the side to meet its own. Even in the pale moonlight, I could see it had no discernible facial features, just a black, stinking mass of mold and fungus, crowned by monstrous, twisted horns. I tried to fight, but with every labored breath I felt weaker and weaker, almost like the rotten stench was displacing all the oxygen around me. I was helpless, forced to witness the unfolding horror through eyes I was sure would soon close forever. Gripped by unfathomable terror, I watched as the thing's face began to writhe and pulsate, as a long, slender tendril began to force its way out from the dark, rotten mass. It felt cold and wet against my cheek, tracing its way along my flesh almost like it was tasting me. Then, right as I was about to pass out, it let go of me, and I could suddenly breathe again. When my senses returned, I could hear Dee Dee screaming at the thing to leave me be. I thought he'd simply continue to flee after the thing caught up with me, but in reality, he'd been searching for some kind of weapon to fight it off. I watched as it slowly approached him, unfazed by the wild swings of the tree branch in his grip. The depth of our friendship had inspired unfathomable bravery in him, but in the face of something so utterly unholy, that well soon ran dry. As his courage dwindled, Dee Dee swung the branch one final time, then turned to flee through the forest. His attempt at a distraction was the single most valiant thing I'd ever witnessed, which made it all the more heart-wrenching when the great horned thing simply lurched forward and brought him down. As Dee Dee screamed and struggled, it repeated the process of tasting him, but unlike myself, the creature seemed to taste something it liked in him. He grew steadily weaker as the moments ticked by, the overpowering, stomach-churning stench having the same effect it had had on me. Then once it was sufficiently satisfied, the creature grabbed him by the ankles, then raised him up into the air. There he dangled, groaning weakly, and it was only then that I noticed just how pronounced the thing's torso was. I had been so fixated on its long, bony limbs and wretched horns that I had barely noticed how engorged its stomach was. It was almost arachnoid in appearance. Spindly appendages surrounded a fat, near-spherical abdomen. From where I was lying, it appeared as if the creature was about to devour my brave young friend, and with a terrible kind of fascination, I wondered how it would do so without a mouth. The creature soon answered my question, and it did so in a way that's crept into my nightmares for almost 65 years afterwards. With one hand clamped around Dee Dee's ankles, the creature used its free hand to get a grip of its large black stomach. It seemed to hook its fingers into a crevice within its flesh. Then, as it tore open its own stomach, the stench intensified until a thick haze seemed to hang in the air around it. But it was no mortal wound the creature had inflicted on itself, no more so than when a marsupial opens up its pouch to its young. And I realized with abject horror that this constituted some kind of nightmarish feeding process. I watched as the creature began to lower Dee Dee, head first into the festering gape where nothing but rotten bark-like flesh had once been. The sickening groan he let out as the hot, corrosive bile touched his face will forever haunt me, and I was so paralyzed with terror that I couldn't find the will to act until his body was half submerged in the creature's vile bowels. In an instant, I found my feet rushing through the snow before grabbing onto Dee Dee's lower legs, which by this point were hanging limply from the creature's festering maw. The second I got a good solid grip of him, I pulled as hard as I could, wanting desperately to free my friend from certain doom. Yet it was a horrifyingly futile mistake. Pulling Dee Dee from the thing's stomach was relatively easy. but the condition of what remained was enough to drive me to madness. He was half digested, but still alive, his face a bare and bloodied skull that bubbled with blubbers of agony. Didi needed no words to communicate the depths of his suffering, and in trying to free him, I had only prolonged it. But before I even had a chance to react, the creature batted me away with one swift strike before unceremoniously shoving what remained of Didi into its stomach. I screamed and cried as he disappeared from view, convinced that I would be next, and my only hope was that my suffering would be over quickly. But to my utter confusion, the creature seemed suddenly and completely disinterested in me. After one final look in my direction, it took a few steps through the snow, then took to the trees, disappearing into the darkness as it went. Sometime later, I staggered out of the woods alone. I was on the verge of catatonia, unable to comprehend the horror of what I'd seen, as well as the senselessness of why Didi had been devoured while I had not. A policeman found me wandering the snowy streets, muttering to myself, and since I was in breach of the curfew, I was taken to the local police station before an officer telephoned my mother. He later said that he smelled the alcohol on my breath and mistook my condition for one of intoxication. It was only when my mother arrived and I broke down in tears that the police learned of Didi's disappearance. To their credit, the police rushed into action, and based on my description of our path through the woods, they were able to locate and follow our footprints until they arrived at the scene of Didi's demise. I was told that the police could quite clearly make out our tracks in the snow and couldn't make sense of why our set of tracks suddenly disappeared. The creature must have left its own set of footprints, but according to the officers, the only other tracks were left by cloven hooves, most likely a deer that had passed through the area in the time after Didi was taken. With no evidence of his murder, my friend Didi Muller remained on the missing persons register for many, many years until he was finally declared dead in absentia. The same went for Willy Hummels, whose family moved away from Nasserite the following year. My mother and I also ended up leaving town, partially to secure better psychiatric care for myself, but mostly because I could no longer function in a place I'd experienced such mind-shattering trauma. To put it kindly, my life in Salzburg was reclusive. At school, I became known as the strange, quiet boy who never left his home after dark, yet in spite of there being very little hope for me, I progressed in my psychiatric treatment and secured a place at university. As you already know, I had been very successful in convincing myself that what I'd experienced was nothing but an elaborate hallucination. That all changed in the early 90s when I received a phone call from an old familiar friend. I didn't recognize the voice on the other end of the line, but I did recognize the man's name. It was a name I hadn't heard in nearly 35 years, and that name was Timo Hummels. Timo had been conducting his own personal investigation into his brother's death and obtained some once confidential investigation reports belonging to the Hungarian police. And that was how we discovered that the disappearances had continued, and together, we tapped into the long-buried memories of the monster that had taken those close to us. We shared a lot that day, our pasts, our presents, our hopes for the future. But what I discovered we didn't share was our will to confront the horrors of our youth. Timo planned on traveling back to Nasserite and to the other Alpine towns who still mourned their missing children. He told me that similar disappearances had been occurring in the same small towns and villages every year since we departed, and he was determined to do something about them. He also told me that he no longer believed that it was the Krampus that had taken his brother, but rather something different, something very real and very dangerous. He invited me to join him in what he claimed would be our lives-defining work, and I heard the muted frustration in his voice when I was forced to decline. I declined because I know what waits for him in the snow-covered forests which surround our Alpine hometown. I might not know its name, though doubtless it's been called many different things through many different eons, but I do know what it is. It is pestilence. It is decay. It is death itself. And it is hungry. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button over here on YouTube to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Slay Queen.